This is a notice for all participants. This is a public meeting and proceedings are being webcast live online. A recording will also be available for playback on the Council's website shortly afterwards. Please note that your name will appear in the live stream and in the recording. Should you not wish for your image to appear on these, please turn off your camera. Third parties should not record or film the local plan hearing sessions, and neither the Council nor the Planning Inspectorate are liable for any third party recordings. Thank you.
Okay, good morning everyone. It's 9:30, so time for me to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells local plan. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. Yeah, excellent. Welcome back for everybody who attended yesterday and on previous sessions. And for those of you who haven't attended any sessions thus far, welcome along. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, a Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination. So this is the sort of second stage of the local plan examination hearing. So the first stage we considered some legal compliance matters, and now we're into soundness issues and starting to look at the sites in a bit more detail. The last week in May, we met in the council offices and we talked about the strategy of the plan and some of the big issues around green belt release, housing numbers, and the strategy of spatial distribution. And we're now going forwards and looking at some of the sites in slightly more detail. I'll just ask Charlotte, the programme officer, just to turn her camera on and just introduce herself and say a quick hello. Charlotte is the programme officer for the examination. So if you do have any queries regarding attending sessions, any links for the virtual sessions or documents, please do let Charlotte know. Her details are on the examination website. Charlotte, was there anything you need to outline at this stage?
No, not at this stage, no.
Okay, thank you very much. I mentioned it yesterday, but I know there's a few new faces on the virtual participant list today. So I'll just go through a quick housekeeping matters again. So as everybody aware, these sessions this week were meant to be held in the council offices, as we have been doing for the other strategic matters. Obviously, due to positive COVID tests within the council's team, we've taken the decision to move these sessions online. I outlined it yesterday, and I won't go through it in much greater detail, but what I would just say is that, you know, clearly I did take people's views into account in reaching a decision to move online. And I know that I've seen some emails and responded to some emails with some concerns about having the online meetings. But we got through everything yesterday. It seemed to work okay. I'll very quickly go through some very technical sort of matters, housekeeping matters with regard to the use of Zoom. So as we've done at previous sessions, the local plan hearings are informal hearings. They're structured discussions which are led by myself. So primarily, as we work through the agenda today, it'll be myself asking questions of the council, and these are some of the soundness issues that I've identified that I'd like to explore in a bit more detail. I will invite participants to speak. Just a word of caution on that, please. When I invite people to speak, and people more than happy to participate, please do stick to the representations that you've made. So the hearing is an opportunity to put your points forward and engage in the discussion and engage in the debate, but it's not an opportunity to introduce any new points or points that you haven't already previously made in your written submissions. And just on that point as well, again, whilst happy for people to participate in the discussion and the debate, I have got everybody's hearing statements. I have got everybody's Regulation 19 representations, and I've been through those in quite some detail now, so we don't need to sort of repeat or read out any representations that have been previously made. They carry exactly the same weight submitted in writing as they do made orally at the hearing sessions. So really the hearing session is an opportunity to explore some of the issues in a bit greater detail. Now, potentially everybody's used Zoom and Microsoft Teams and these sort of online formats before, but I appreciate there may be people who haven't. So I'll very quickly just explain how it's going to work. So I'll have my camera on at all times. and also mute and unmute myself when I'm speaking. As we did yesterday, if I can ask the council sort of main team to do the same rather than sort of flicking cameras on and off, that'd be much appreciated. I won't go around the room and ask everybody to introduce themselves now. So the first time you speak, if you can let me know who you are, if you're acting on behalf of a particular client or landowner or developer, that'd be much appreciated. And when you do wish to speak, if you use the raise hand function, so there's two ways that you might have this. So if at the bottom where I've got participants, I've got a raise hand function, but for other people at the bottom of the screen, there's various tabs, one of which says reactions. And if you click on reactions, there's a raise hand bar. So I can just do that now on my screen there. The raise hand comes up and then I can lower the hand as well. So if you do wish to speak, use the raise hand function. At that stage, turn your camera on, unmute your microphone, introduce yourself, and also invite you to participate in the discussion. And when you finish speaking, just lower your hand and turn your camera and your microphone back off again. That'd be much appreciated. As with the other hearing sessions, we'll stop mid-morning, certainly for a break. We may have shorter sessions. I appreciate that people are staying at the screen for long periods of time, so I will bear that in mind and try and have frequent breaks. When we have a break mid-morning or mid-afternoon, don't log out, just turn your camera off, turn your microphone off. However, when we break for lunch, this afternoon session is a different session with a different login. So when we break for lunch, which will be around 1 o'clock, leave the meeting, and then there should be a separate link, unless Charlotte tells me quickly that's wrong. There should be a separate link for this afternoon session. So I'll remind everyone at lunchtime, but at lunchtime, log out and then log back in for this afternoon session. And hopefully the technology should be fine, but maybe just log in a few minutes before and just make sure that everything is connected as it should do. And if anybody has any problems during the meeting, or needs to log out or log back in because their broadband's not working or having technology problems, speak to Charlotte, contact Charlotte. Charlotte is here sort of in the background, but speak to Charlotte outside of the hearing, and we can take an adjournment or have a break to try and allow people time to sort of log back in and resolve any issues that they've got. So I've set an agenda for today, which everybody should have. If not, there should be copies available online. I'm sure that Charlotte can circulate the agendas as required. What we'll do is we'll go through the agenda. And what I would just say, and I said yesterday, these are the issues that I've set out based on the representations that I've read, the hearing statements that I've read, but also some of the debate that we've already had. Obviously, we've already talked about issues such as flooding, the sequential test, and we'll come on to talk about that in greater detail today with regard to the western parts of land at Paddock Wood, for example, and highways issues. But what I would just say is, if other representatives have a point that they wish to raise that's maybe not on the agenda, please let me know. The hearing's an opportunity to allow participants to put their points forward. So please do let me know. So that was a very sort of brief, quick introduction to the format of the hearings, the technology. As I said, it seemed to work okay yesterday. Obviously, we've had other hearing sessions where we've explored some of these issues as well. Just in terms of the council, any matters arising before we get going?
No, thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so turning to today's agenda. So the first area that I want to really go through, and we touched upon similar issues yesterday in regard to Tudor Village strategic site, and that's whether or not it's clear to decision makers, developers, and the local community what mix of uses will be provided on each parcel and when. So really, a question to the council to kick this topic off. Do you think that the plan as submitted is sufficiently clear as to what's actually going to be provided on each parcel? And that's with regard to numbers of residential accommodation, where things like extra care provision will be set out. So do you think it's clear and effective?
So I'm going to ask Hannah Young to start this session off, please.
Thank you. Yes, we do think it's sufficiently clear, and I'm probably going to make similar arguments that we made yesterday in terms of the rationale to how we came up with the policy for Paddock Wood and East Capel. From the outset, I think, and we've always made clear, and it was made clear in the brief to the master planning services, to all the site promoters at the outset of this process through the Strategic Sites Working Group, that when it was determined through the SA and the Sheila that it was appropriate to allocate lands around Paddock Wood to the east and west to drive forward the growth, we made it clear that we were going to be delivering that through a sort of transformational urban extension to Paddock Wood, and that it would need to be comprehensively master planned as one and fully integrated into the new settlement, so that the whole expanded Paddock Wood, including the land in East Capel, became a garden settlement. And it's on that basis that the master planning work that was undertaken by David Locke Associates, and we do have Miss Cave here with us, who will can add stuff to what I'm saying accordingly. And that was the approach they took, and that's how the structure plan has been formulated, if you like, to look at the growth as one. David Locke, when they undertook the master planning exercise, did it on an ownership blind basis. So they didn't look at who owned what land. They looked at the land, looked at the constraints and opportunities, and sought to see how much housing could be delivered to create a sustainable settlement, along with the identified infrastructure, the linkages and permeability, and taking into consideration the constraints such as flood risk, which I know we're going to come on to, and the greenbelt landscape considerations further to the west. Accordingly, and I think the inspector will note through our submissions and the evidence base, the approach to the master planning has sought to share a number of items of infrastructure, and given the opportunities and constraints relating to both parcels, we have pushed the density, well, the amount of housing on the eastern parcel, and allowed for some of the open space and sports provision to be brought together as one, which we think offers a really great opportunity to Paddock Wood, along with wider open spaces to the west, the wetland park, to flood mitigation, and by doing that, we've been able to plan a really sort of comprehensive expansion. And as we've mentioned yesterday with the Chudley Village Master Plan, what the structure plan is, and it's referred to within the policy, and there is a map showing it, is it's not a fixed blueprint. It's a structure plan that demonstrates to us that we can deliver the amount of homes that we have within the policy, along with the identified infrastructure. And we've only sought to prescribe where we thought and consider it to be absolutely necessary to do so. So, for example, with the primary schools, we have an identified need for two form-entry primary schools. And through the master planning undertaken by David Locke Associate, it was considered appropriate that should be on either parcel. So we have said that we would expect a primary school to be on the eastern parcel and a primary school to be on the western parcel. You'll note when looking at the structure plan that there are, we've got the western parcel and the eastern parcel, but the western parcel is divided by the railway line, and we have got connectivity across the railway line, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure. But for the local centres, which are there to serve the day-to-day shopping needs, we have sought to prescribe that there should be a local centre in the eastern parcel, the northwestern parcel and the southwestern parcel, again, to maximise the connectivity to local residents. But we haven't sought to prescribe it any further than that, but to just say that it should be accessible by most people in sort of capturing those aims for sustainable growth. So it was sort of trying to find the balance of not prescribing too much, to allow each individual site promoter to come forward with their own master plan that would be developed through framework SPDs, and then subsequently through the development management process to really drive forward how we've set the key parameters set out in policy. And I'm conscious of echoing yesterday, but in terms of the permeable linkages, the flood risk mitigation, the landscape considerations, whilst identifying where appropriate to do so, the key items of infrastructure. Now, you mentioned specifically the extra care accommodation. You'll note that there's a requirement in the policy for an extra care provision for elderly. We haven't prescribed where that will be, and we haven't prescribed the scale of it. As mentioned yesterday, it wasn't considered necessary to prescribe the scale of it because it's market-led, and that's the approach we've taken. And equally, in frank terms, from a master planning point of view, it doesn't matter if it's on the eastern or western parcel. So it wasn't considered necessary to prescribe that. However, and this is noted by all the site promoters in the shared position statement, which is appended to our hearing statement on this matter, that all the site promoters, or the 4 principal site promoters around Paddock Wood and East Capel, are fully aware that that is a requirement, and consider it appropriate to be considering where this will be located through the more detailed master plan, but they are all aware and accepting that this will need to be provided on one of the parcels. With the Gypsy and Traveller provision, we have an identified need for 3 pitches. There's something we have mentioned in our hearing statement, that the structure plan alludes to this, and the policy alludes to this being on the eastern and western parcel, and that is actually something that we would like to amend through a modification, because in fact the demand is for 3 pitches in one single location, albeit the way our policy was worded, it isn't unsound insofar as we haven't fixed it. I think you'll note that the policy says it is expected that this will be provided either on the eastern and western parcel, but we consider it would be more effective if that was amended to show that we expect it to be in a single location to meet the needs of smaller families as identified through our evidence base. But again, it wasn't considered necessary to stipulate exactly where that needed to be, because that can be subject to a number of considerations and discussions through detailed master planning stage, albeit again, you'll note that we are actively discussing that with Crest Nicholson on a parcel of land they own at the moment, and seeking to understand in more detailed master plan how that could be accommodated. But I think drawing all that together, we have the framework there in place. The framework is very clear. If the item of infrastructure is directed to a specific parcel, that is mentioned. If it isn't, it is because it covers the allocation as a whole, and we think it is clear, and it sets out all the policy parameters, and there'll be some areas we come to under green button landscaping that we can discuss later this afternoon where that could be strengthened. But we think as a whole, as a framework, it's appropriate to have the one policy, because it is so important that this is looked at as one and delivered as one. But also we think the policy as worded is set out clearly in terms of what needs to be provided where and when.
In terms of the numbers of residential dwellings then per parcel, is that obviously there's a headline figure within policy STR SS1. Does the plan specify dwelling numbers per parcel? And if not, why not? And do you think it should or should not?
I'm just quickly checking if it's in the supporting text. Apologies. It's not in the policy. It is just that broad figure. And the way we've approached it, and through, I think, discussions with David Locke Associates, was that we know through their master planning that this level can be achieved. And obviously the strategic sites infrastructure and master planning study is referenced within the policy, albeit with regard to developer contributions, but it is referenced, and that does set out under option 1 the number of houses for each parcel. I'm just trying to find the reference for that, Joe. I don't know if it's page 94, sets out how that could be accommodated, and David Locke Associates have set out how they've come to that. So it's table 6 on page 94 of core document 3.66a, and David Locke Associates have set out in their document how they've come to that conclusion in terms of the average density that they've applied. And we know that the house builders are going to seek to want to maximise the amount of development that they are going to provide on their sites, whilst having to provide all the other infrastructure as set out in our plan. So it wasn't considered necessary to set that out, because the framework as a whole, when delivered through master planning, would meet targets there, and potentially even higher or lower depending on certain situations. But we're confident of that figure, so we didn't include it. But again, if it was something that you thought would assist the effectiveness of the policy, then we would be comfortable in including that for either within the policy itself or in the supporting text as to provide further clarity, because it has all stemmed from this document. We're confident in this, and we'd be happy to insert that.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether, obviously, the MPPF talks about policies being clear and effective, and whether or not decision makers, but probably more importantly the local community in this instance, actually knows the scale of residential development proposed on each parcel. So I think you're right. I think the policy is submitted has probably got sufficient detail around, it talks about where the schools would be, for example, and things like that. And we'll come on to talk about some of those issues in a bit more detail. But just in terms of headline sort of residential numbers, whether or not they should be set out in the policy. Let's just take some views on this then. We'll start with Claire Riley, please.
Hello. Sorry, the question you asked was about whether the numbers in the provision were clear, and Mr. Young seems to have answered the question about infrastructure. Do you want to talk about infrastructure under this, or do you want to talk about infrastructure later?
We might come on to it. Let's just stick with whether or not it's clear to people what uses are going to be. So, what land uses are going to be provided on each parcel of land.
Okay, well, I just think that I think the master planning, if she wants to talk about the master planning, identifying what uses, I don't think it is sufficiently clear, simply because it doesn't look at cumulative effects on things like flooding of all the sites, and it also doesn't look at the highways, cumulative effect on highways of all the sites collectively. There's no link from the eastern developments, which she's just said again will be developed more intensively. There's no link from the eastern developments to the north up towards the hop farm. And I think their own figures show that there will be an additional 2,400 daily traffic movements from those sites across Paddock Wood. And I can't really see how they'll go on the sufficient road network. So I really don't think there's enough detail. I think that the David Locke's work is on the framework and the infrastructure is just insufficiently detailed. But as I say, I don't think that was the question you asked. I think you were asking about clarity within the numbers and so forth. And I think you're probably going to come on to the infrastructure. So I've certainly got more to say about that, but I don't think that was the question you were asking. So I'm not quite sure how we went from the question you asked onto the infrastructure delivery plan and the so-called master planning that's been done by David Locke Associates. So I'm going to stop now.
Okay, Mr. Jones.
Good morning, sir. My name is Gregory Jones, Queen's Counsel, instructed by Provision Catherine Mills on my right, who's also operating the camera on behalf of Cooper Strategic Land Limited. So you asked whether the policy is clear, and you'll see from our representations on this issue, your questions 1 and 3, our position. First of all, that it's not. We have a particular interest in extra care, but it's a good example of what is a wider problem. And in terms of extra care, the only reference one finds to extra care is in the David Locke Master Plan, is in relation to various workshops that were had, and talks about possibilities of how extra care or physiotherapist was dealt with. That's clearly not clear and effective. And then second, and that's borne out, and we agree with what Judith Ashton says, and for your note, for Redrow Persimmons, and in her representations at 14.1, she makes the point, and we respectfully agree with her, that it's not clear as to how extra care will be dealt with. And then for your notes, 14.2, she refers to the pre-application discussions. So it's a very good example of the local authority, we know, we all act, and they're going to get rolled over on this policy by the House, but with anyone who's properly represented. There's been no concern in pre-application of, she says at 14.2. And then there's talk that it might then be delivered by an SPD. And this is the wider picture, sir, that I do raise to you, and which has emerged. We've raised it a number of times, but my submission, as I've sat through this hearing, has become clearer and clearer that the council's policies are not effective. And what's happening is they're saying manana will turn the master plans into SPDs. Now, 20 years ago, before the case law, you might have got away with that. But can I just give you the reference? It's one of a series of cases, but the William Davies case, it's William and Davies, DAVIS, against Charnwood Borough Council. You're probably aware of it. It's 2017 EWHC 3006 admin, and that's what we were referring to in terms. And what that says, and it may, you know, it is now the case that SPD can be used for very, very little. And an SPD means that any document containing statements regarding any environmental, social, design, economic objectives which are relevant to the attainment of the plan cannot be an SPD if they identify development and the use of land which the authority wishes to encourage, if they make site allocations, but also if they're setting development management to guide application decisions. And that latter prohibition, that an SPD cannot set development management to guide application decisions. And what I'm hearing from the council, in effect, in answer to your questions, is at the moment flexible policy, and it'll come forward tomorrow, manana, through worked up master planning that would take the form of an SPD to guide application developments in development control. That's precisely what the courts have said you can't do. So this plan would be, it seems to me, both what we've discussing today and yesterday, is fundamentally unsound, because it relies on securing effectiveness through SPDs, which the courts have told us, unless there's an amendment to the regulations, which there isn't, you can't do. So whilst we are a victim of that specifically in terms of elderly care, and we make all of those submissions in respect as we've done elderly care, it isn't clear and effective. But I do flag up to you, sir, that there is a wider problem of which we are just one example. Thank you very much, sir.
Just in response to that then, and I guess it's the same question for the overall dwelling numbers then. Presumably, these parcels of land are going to come forward as individual planning applications. So western parcel, eastern parcel, etc. So presumably they're going to come forward as individual plan applications. Whoever comes forward first, say for example, they don't adhere to the numbers of dwellings and the mixes of uses that were considered suitable and appropriate in the master plan. How would the council at the plan application stage consider that plan application? How would the council turn around and say, well, no, that's not what was expecting? And the main thing there really is, the dwelling numbers, whether or not you need extra care. How would the council actually, or a decision maker, actually effectively make a decision on whether that development is appropriate or not?
So, can I first of all apologise, because, and particularly to you, Mr. Jones, because I missed half of what he said. I don't know if it was my computer or what, but halfway through Manona Friends submissions, my screen went blank. So forgive me if I haven't picked up all he's had to say, particularly the reference to the case law. But just turning to the policy itself, it requires the submission of 4 SPDs. Let's ignore for the moment the expression supplementary planning documents and just see what in substance it's requiring a developer to do. it's requiring, first of all, the submission of a structure plan, so-called. And that structure plan may or may not be similar to that which is shown in the plan itself, the David Locke Associates structure plan, which identifies areas in each of the parcels for particular types of development. So spatially, the types of development will be identified and approved through the submission of a structure plan. And that structure plan is intended, therefore, to govern the disposition of uses and the way in which the 3 further documents to be submitted will show how that development is to be treated in each of the 3 parcels. So, and that process will require the approval of the local authority. So we will start with the overall structure plan, that will be approved. Then it will be expected that each of the SPDs will be approved for so long as they comply with the approved structure plan. And thereafter, any subsequent applications will be made in accordance with the approved structure plan and area-specific plans as approved. So that's how it's seen to work. As we discussed yesterday, it would be appropriate to have in the policy also the requirement for the submission of a phasing and implementation plan to ensure that supporting infrastructure and complementary uses are provided at the appropriate stages of each development. So overall, this policy requires a structured approach to the submission of applications, which will follow the approved structure plan and the 3 supplementary planning documents, as they're called here, in that order.
In terms of that requirement then, do you think that that is appropriate and proportionate? It sounds like what the council's requiring developers to do then is there needs to be an overall structure plan, which would be an SPD. So who would do that overall structure plan? Obviously, we know, obviously, we'll come to Ms. Ashton in a minute, but we know from previous discussions and representations that, you know, the council's held pre-application discussions and you know, that development detail has been worked up and heading towards a plan application. So who would do this overall structure plan?
So the overall structure plan, the SPDs will all be led by Tunbridge Wells Borough Council.
Right.
The overall structure plan, particularly so, and it is anticipated that that will predominantly reflect the strategic sites and infrastructure master planning study with the necessary amendments and to progress that as an SPD. That is the structure plan that we have been offering pre-application discussions on lands east of the Paddock Wood and very initial discussions with the promoters on the western parcels alongside. Everyone, all the site promoters have been working very positively together as part of the strategic sites working group and are all, and I'm sure they will reiterate themselves today, are all on board with delivering it in line with the structure plan and have all sense checked and agreed with the numbers within the parcels in terms of housing need, etc. The site-specific, parcel-specific SPDs will be more of a joint working relationship between ourselves and the site promoters as they are developing the more detailed master planning insofar as we're progressing an SPD with Redrow and Persimmon at the moment on lands east of Paddock Wood. We have agreed to work together to do that using the expertise and the master planning of the applicants and the site promoters in terms of developing the scheme and the detailed work they are doing, whilst, you know, working alongside them and inputting and providing advice and you know, on design code, etc., as part of that. So that's a very much a dual process, which is in parallel with, if you like, with the pre-application discussions, because they go hand in hand. We're progressing a detailed master plan from this very thorough structure plan, which has been used a lot of information and a lot of evidence to understand the constraints and opportunities, and an extensive infrastructure framework underpinning that. So it's we have this structure plan, and whilst that supplementary planning document is not in place, and it cannot be formally in place until we have an adopted local plan, and our LDS does set that out, we have this evidence-based document that has enabled us to begin progressing the more detailed master plans with the applicants on those individual parcels to progress. And that's how we're considering and guiding pre-application discussions at the moment, in line with the emerging draft policy. And you know, East Paddock Wood is coming forward, you know, more ahead of the parcel and alongside this examination process, but they are working in line with this emerging policy as required by ourselves.
Does the policy actually require since the development we delivered through the production of these 4 master plan SPDs, obviously said that the council is going to be leading on that structure one. I think I tend to share some of the concerns that have been raised. That obviously, when you get to plan application stage, you're into, you know, section 38(6) territory, decisions in accordance with the development plan, and the development plan as submitted wouldn't actually tell you, as a decision maker, how many dwellings should be on what parcel, and in terms of the extra care, whether or not it needs to be provided. So you could get that first plan application, it might be for more dwellings, it might be for fewer dwellings than you've identified in this framework master plan that sits alongside the local plan, but that's not development plan policy. And equally, it might not provide any extra care, because the developer might turn around and say, well, there's no demand, we don't want to. And I'm not sure as to the development plan, which is your local plan policy, would then actually give you much to say, well, no, this is what we've envisaged, and this is what needs to be provided. And we're all abundantly clear it's not going to be left to SPDs, which wouldn't be development plan documents. I don't know. Without looking at and I have to sort of sit down and go through each point in very specific detail, I do think, again, I do sort of tend to share some of the concerns that maybe there isn't enough sort of meat in the policy, if you like, to say this is what we are going to require of the developers on each parcel. And we'll come on to talk about, you know, infrastructure provision, and I think the same goes for that. But let's take some views on what other people think, in particular, sort of the developers who are actually actively involved. Sorry, I'm just muting myself. Okay, we'll go to Judith Ashton next, please.
Morning, sir. Judith Ashton, acting for Redborough and Persimmon on land east of Paddock Wood. A couple of things, if I may. The first is, thank you for Mr. Jones in cross-referencing my representations for me, but they do have to be seen in the totality of what was said, sir. As much as whilst we do agree that there isn't sufficient reference to the details of what is required across the different sites in Paddock Wood, we have made it clear that in progressing our application, we are looking at the master plan document that has been prepared to date by David Locke Associates in detail with Tunbridge Wells Borough Council, and that there is the potential to provide for some form of extra care within the development, but as yet that has not been defined. I have to say I do share your sympathies in terms of development management longer term, and how you actually do have a hook upon which to determine applications given what is said within the policy at the moment. That said, the policy itself does actually cross-refer to the SPD and the master planning documents, and as Miss Young has referred to, you do have the local development not the local development framework, sorry, the local development scheme, which is a core document itself, and that sets out the timetable for both the production of the master planning documents and the SPDs, how they dovetail with the determination of the applications, and therefore does give an indication of potential assurances as to what is being proposed will be delivered. I mean, from, again, our experience on what we are doing east of Paddock Wood, we are promoting an application at the moment, which is a hybrid application. We are liaising with the local authority through the PPA on what is to be provided through the development. And we are, as Ms Young has referred to, working up an SPD for consultation that will demonstrate how the land east of Paddock Wood will deliver over the longer term what is suggested in the local plan. That is really as far as we can take it, given what is drafted and where we are at the moment. But I think it would be disingenuous to suggest that what the local authority are seeking and what the site promoters are thereafter looking to provide, having regard to the discussions we've had to date, would deviate significantly from what has been proposed. I mean, our master plan might look to identify the local centre in a slightly different place and the school in a slightly different place, but other than that, it is looking to deliver what is suggested within the David Locke master planning document.
Presumably, based on what we've heard from the council, so I know we're getting ahead in this, but it's useful to understand the context of how the plan's actually going to work. But obviously, you said there, you're sort of progressing ahead, and you're in a more advanced stage than other allocations in the plan. But we've heard from the council that actually the council needs to do this framework master plan SPD. So is this not a working example of, you're pressing ahead, you're looking at planning performance agreements, you're looking at submitting plan applications. Let's work in a hypothetical situation that this plan was adopted. This plan was adopted in 6 months' time, this policy became a development plan. Is your situation not just a working example of how, well, the council hasn't produced a framework master plan, and here's an application that's come forward, so decision makers left. Council's decision maker, or whoever that decision maker may be, is left in a situation where they've got plan application 1 comes in for the eastern parcel, and that may have its own SPD or its own detailed master plan and show how everything's going to be produced. But there isn't that overarching supplementary planning document. There isn't that overarching requirement to sort of plan comprehensively. And this goes back to some of the concerns that other people have raised. And I'm struggling to understand how that would work. Plan's adopted, your parcel comes in as a plan application. The council's obviously been in this process, adopting its local plan. It hasn't created its framework, structure, overarching master plan SPD. It's not even started on it, let alone drafted it, consulted on it, etc., etc. So then as a decision maker, how does the decision maker then determine application 1 that's come in at the early stages?
If I come in to that one, I think going back to my points made in the previous discussion was that the structure plan, so core document 3.66A, the strategic sites infrastructure and master planning study, that structure plan is the structure plan that's going to be taken forward as a framework master plan SPD. The overarching SPD that the subsequent SPDs will feed into. You'll note from our local development scheme, and I haven't got the core document number, sorry, but the local development scheme appendix 1 sets out the timeframes for the preparation of these SPDs. We are preparing the SPDs, whilst the local plan examination is going in place, and the structure plan. Essentially, we have that. We have that. It's just not an SPD status, but we have this document which is heavily referred to. Well, it is referred to in policy and in the supporting text. All the site promoters have been party to this master planning process. They fed into it, they contributed to it, they form part of everyone through the strategic sites working group understands that it's this document that is referred to in our local plan that will be is the framework they need to be considering their more detailed planning applications against. So you are right that it isn't adopted yet, it isn't in place because it cannot be, because we haven't got an adopted local plan, but we have essentially a heavily drafted document that needs to be essentially just produced as an SPD. This has been subject to consultation as part of the formation of the structure plan, and it's giving us an evidence-based document to be providing DM pre-application advice and to enable the land to the east of Paddock Wood to provide a more detailed master plan.
And so if I could just add to that there are a couple of elements. So extra care provision, the position of that, which we would envisage being, well, it needs to be finalised and fixed through the SPD. But if we go back to the original intention for the policy and the use of SPD, so this was drafted in 2020, then subject to Regulation 19 consultation in 2021. Ms Young's spoken at quite some length about the flexibility and how we've looked to ensure that there is flexibility in the policy. What's happened since then, including through the submission of representations at Regulation 19, including through the pre-application discussions with Redrow and Persimmon, it has all proved that the structure plan that was undertaken originally can form the basis of that SPD, which is what the council had always thought it could do. That we've not had wild deviations from that at all. There's been broad support for the overall quantum of developments in the different parcels. As I said, there are, and the extra care provision is perhaps the most prominent one, some elements that need to be refined. But so this has all been set out in the LDS from earlier stages, and the most recent update includes the timetables for the structure plan, for that to be adopted, consulted on and adopted shortly after the adoption of the local plan, and for those to be in place ahead of the determination of any planning application, of which the one which is most firmly advanced is the Redrow and Persimmon one.
Notwithstanding what I know others have said about the content of your SPDs and relying on those, the other issue is the policy is submitted says that development will be delivered through the production of 4 framework master plan SPDs. These relate to an overall structure and 3 further SPDs in relation to the following parcels. So you've got north, west, east. The framework master plans will guide developers and local planning authority in respect to the garden settlement principles, etc., etc., etc. Where does the local plan actually require the provision and, well, the provision of these SPDs? Obviously, you're saying that you're going to set out this overarching SPD, and then each of the 3 parcels of land, the developers will then do their own SPDs. Where does the plan actually require this process to be carried forward? And I guess I'll ask the question another way, is should the local plan not just say, well, should the local plan not be more directive and just say, development will only be approved subject to the provision of an overarching master plan looking at infrastructure provision, phasing, delivery, land uses, etc. I've just got some concerns about how effective this sort of reliance upon SPDs is actually going to be.
Understood, sir. So I would draw your attention to, it's in the supporting text, it's paragraph 5.196, which sets out that the SPDs will need to be adopted before any planning permissions for substantial new development at that part of Paddock Wood and East Capel are granted, unless exceptional circumstances arise. However, noting your concerns about these points, the council would be happy to look at strengthening of the policy itself in relation to these points, to provide that greater clarity around and to draw around the uses, the numbers, and to draw the links to what is in the structure plan, and to be very clear about the need for the SPDs to be in place prior to the grant of permission. Completely accept it's in the supporting text.
Yeah, it's something I need to look at and sort of ponder and consider, but I think I'd sort of lay a marker down that I do share some of the concerns that there's perhaps a reliance on the detail will be in SPDs, supplementary planning documents, but the local plan can't require accordance with a non-development plan document. It can't say this development must be in accordance with something in an SPD, because then to accord with the development plan, you've got to accord with a non-development plan document. It's a very technical planning point, but hopefully I'm not sort of losing local residents at this point. But the importance of it is key, is that I do share the concern that say, well, shunt it into SPDs, well, they don't form part of the development plan.
And so if I'm conscious Mr. Cheddarevian wants to speak, but I would just say that the one point, and I think you mentioned it yesterday, in terms of the balance between flexibility when planning for garden settlements / strategic sites, and perhaps the that control over delivery. The council has explained why it's perhaps gone to the side of flexibility more so than the very or more prescriptive elements, but and hopefully you've understood the explanation as to why we've done that, but of course happy to as yesterday, happy to consider those. And sorry, Mr. Cheddarevian.
So I'm conscious that there are other participants who want to speak. I'll just say this for now. As you can imagine, my mind has been working on this. And first of all the necessary components are there. They may need strengthening in places. The situation that pertains here is no different to that which pertains elsewhere with respect to garden settlements, where proposals, where land ownerships are not with one but several owners. I will give thought as to how this policy can be restructured with respect to the provision of master planning and the requirement that applications for planning permission should be consistent with and follow the approved master plan. And also within the policy, setting out the requisite elements of the development and their location, so far as it's appropriate to do so for the purposes of this policy. I'm very mindful I'm very mindful of the points put forward by objectors, and I fully take on board also the fact that it would not be appropriate for this policy to defer matters to SPDs, which are essentially policy matters. I fully accept that, and fully, so far as I heard it, Mr. Jones, my apologies, your helpful submissions in relation to those legal points. But I'm taking this on board, and I would probably need a little bit more time in which to consider and take instructions on how the policy could be restructured and formulated in such a way that its essential requirements can be given effect on basis that people will understand exactly what is expected of them and what is expected of the development. I can come back more on these points in due course once we've heard from other objectors, if that would assist you, sir.
Okay, let's go around the virtual room then. So again, I'll take people as they crop up on my screen, so apologies if it's not a logical order. Go to Ms. Borland first, please.
One very quick point to make about this. I've been listening carefully to the discussion, and it's making me increasingly worried about the control around this, on the basis that just under a year ago, a planning application, well, an application for an environmental impact assessment scoping opinion was put in for the parcel, the eastern parcel, which was for about 10% fewer dwellings than are set out in the Strategic Sites Master Planning document. And CPRE commented on this at the time, but the environmental scoping opinion information was sent out. And yes, I'm sitting here listening to everybody saying, oh, no, we're all talking about it and sticking to what was agreed in that document. And I'm just finding that very worrying, because if we have a 10% reduction across the whole of this development, what's that going to do to meeting the housing numbers?
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Polly Canning next, please.
Oh. Hi there. I'm here on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Whetstone, who live at Tudley Farm, which is located at the north of Paddock Wood and accessed off the A228. It's references DPC 19 in the Sheila. And we've been talking about the structure plan this morning. And according to that, Tudley Farm forms a legitimate and important part of the integrated master plan vision for the western parcel of growth at Paddock Wood. However, also as discussed this morning, the policy itself reads more as a guidance than as development plan policy. So the boundaries aren't fixed and the policy is vague and non-committal. So as a consequence, my clients are left unsure as to whether their property is actually included within the Western development parcel or not. So the implications either way are considerable. These concerns and uncertainties are further reinforced now that a statement of common ground has been published with between Crest and the council, which says that they're pressing ahead with an application for the western parcel of development around Paddock Wood and kind of effectively rowing their own boat, disregarding, in our view, the master planning process and the comprehensive development opportunities within the policy. So this is really unacceptable. It directly contradicts the stated ambitions of the plan, providing a holistic and comprehensive development. So I'm here today to speak in relation to the general approach taken and to really ask that boundaries are fixed now and that any opportunities for the council or site promoters to cherry pick land to suit their needs has to be removed. As I said, you know, this site, Tudley Farm, it sits in a green and blue strategic landscape corridor on the structure plan. And this is recognised as a core component in the acceptability and deliverability of the proposed development. It effectively acts as a facilitator to the wider site allocation by providing a green setting for thousands of new homes, providing important ecological habitat, and acting as an essential element to flood alleviation. At the Reg 18 stage, my client's site didn't feature as part of the draft allocation. So we duly submitted reps identifying that the site was available, suitable and deliverable, and provided a strong and credible case to support the inclusion of the site into the wider allocation. And the council ultimately and the David Locke Associates agreed that Tudley Brook Farm should be included. And it's important to remember, and we've talked about this before, that DLA were critical in this master planning process, and it was an ownership blind exercise undertaken completely independently, and it was this work that resulted in the high level master plan, the structure plan. And as a result of this, we were asked to participate in a strategic site working group, and we were asked actually to contribute financially to the fees in creating the master plan, and the commitment was entered in good faith. And on the back of this detailed work, the structure plan was prepared, and the policy, which promises an opportunity for betterment, for flooding, for comprehensive development, for multifunctional green space. But then actually, when you look into the detail and the precise wording of the policy, there's little commitment to delivering these benefits in a comprehensive manner, contrary to the originally stated aims. Instead, parcels of land for development are only provisional, with paragraph 5.195 of the policy specifically stating that boundaries may alter, not defining the geographical extent of development at this stage is completely unacceptable, particularly because smaller sites such as Tudley Brook Farm run the risk of being marginalised and isolated from the plan and application process, and implications of flood risk and planning blight and so on for my client. At this late stage in the process, we are completely left in the dark as to whether Tudley Brook Farm is going to be included as part of the development proposal for the western parcel or not. So we have real concerns with the policy. It enables the larger landowners to work to their own agenda, in our view. And the smaller but vitally important sites, such as Tudley Brook Farm, are being marginalised to the detriment of the overall plan vision and interests of acknowledged importance, including amenity provision, open space, blue and green infrastructure, flood alleviation, and biodiversity enhancement. These are all key and central planks of the overall master plan vision. So I referred in my introduction to the statement of common ground between the council and Crest, and that provides a real insight into how the parties intend to work together. It confirms that Crest will be submitting a planning application for the land within its control only. And so our question is, what does that mean for our client, and which forms part of the legitimate allocation for the western parcel in the structure plan? In our view, it suggests that this important site will be completely sidelined, which is fundamentally wrong and contrary to the ownership line master planning vision that underpins the policy. Another concern raised in our statement is what we've discussed earlier, is that everything's being deferred to the SPD stage. It's not transparent. The creation of these documents falls outside the examination process and not subject to public scrutiny. So leaving critically important matters, such as defining the site boundaries to the SPD application stage, directly contradicts the government's stated aims that planning systems should be genuinely plan-led. So instead of deferring all the work to the SPD stage, please can we ask that there's greater commitment in the policy towards reaching the stated aims of the master plan, and the site boundaries are fixed now rather than at the SPD stage. There needs to be more clarity for my client site. The scale and extent of the green and blue infrastructure elements need to be better defined, and the site boundaries have to be fixed to ensure that the policy is found sound. Thank you.
Just by way of quick clarification, Tudley Brook Farm, that's within the site allocation?
It is, yes. It's DPC 19.
Yeah. So that's within the allocation shown on the policies map.
Yes, but the boundaries are only provisional at this stage. There's nothing in the policy fixing this at all.
Okay. Sorry, I was on mute. Mr. Hayes, please.
Thank you, sir. Troy Hayes, on behalf of Paddock Wood Town Council. Yeah, just to say that we feel that this policy is entirely ineffective and not at all justified. We do absolutely share your concerns in terms of the way this policy is set out, and you haven't lost it. You haven't lost the local community on this point at all. This has always been a central concern to local residents and to Paddock Wood Town Council. I think what's happened here is really about putting the cart before the horse. Hopefully the horse hasn't already bolted. Absolutely agree with the last points made about this not being a local plan led approach to Paddock Wood. I think what's happened is there's been a lot of documents prepared in the background, far too much reliance on the David Locke work, which really has no status. It hasn't been through a local plan process. Far too much reliance on that. I think prior to the hearings, I was quite confused by the policy. I think having heard what we've just heard from the council, it just raises even more confusion. In my experience of doing garden settlements, I think one of the key things is you actually do need quite a good level of certainty and clarity on as many matters as possible, or in my experience, it will be every developer for themselves. My first question was actually about the structure plan itself, which is within the local plan. And I'm still unclear as to whether that structure plan is being examined as part of this local plan examination, or is it a separate document. I think what we heard from the council is that it's still yet to come. So what is its status, and what's the point of it being in the local plan? In terms of the policies map, the policies map actually just shows one large allocation, so it doesn't go into any detail about various parcels itself, apart from PW1, which I think just calls it a residential area. Just wanted to pick up on the point where the council is talking about flexibility versus the level of prescription within the policy, and they're referring to the discussions about Toodley yesterday. And I just want to say that the situation is very different in Paddock Wood. The difference between here and Toodley is Toodley has one landowner and no planning applications already approved, as far as I'm aware, or no planning applications that are on the imminent horizon. There's at least 4 landowners for the area within this allocation, not to mention the development that's already been permitted at Paddock Wood. We understand there's an application coming in on the east of Paddock Wood as well very soon, so that's all being prepared. And not to mention that this area is actually within a floodplain, making these issues even more elevated in terms of their potential impact on flood risk. So overall, it really feels like the approach the council is taking in this policy and the local plan is a recipe for chaos, and really for the required infrastructure not being delivered, and for developers rushing to submit their planning applications so they aren't the last ones holding the hot potato, which I think we all know is the likely outcome of this. So I agree with what the others said about everything's being pushed onto SPDs or looking at a structure plan that was prepared that has no status. I think one of the other key questions I just wanted to raise was, how can the evidence prepared already have properly assessed the parcels and the allocation and the for each of the parcels if they didn't know the quantum of development for each of the locations? So I think it raises a bigger question about a lot of the evidence that sits behind the local plan, if they don't know how much development might be delivered in each of the parcels. And just on the 2 points about older persons housing and gypsies and travelers, as far as I understand it, the older persons housing consideration wasn't part of the strategic sites meetings that took place. And in regards to gypsies and traveler pitches, we understand that 3 pitches were recently approved. So is a question to the council as to, are they now saying 6 pitches, or has the need now been met through those three permissions? Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Moon, please.
Good morning, sir, Inspector, and all the others on the Zoom meeting. I'm welcome that the master plan has been picked up in the detail this morning, because if you look at experience in Paddock Wood Labour Party, I'm representing. If you look in Paddock Wood over the last 30 years, we've had massive development. And we recognised some time ago that we needed some form of coordinated process within the planning organisation, maybe a step that no one else has thought of within other boroughs across the country, to create a master plan for the present 3 developments that we've got. That's the one at Badsall Road, the one at Green Lane, and the one at Church Farm. Now, if you look at an example of a master plan not working and how that actually tries to benefit the community, indeed the people that are moving in, and all the infrastructure, all the facilities within that community, it's a good example where it didn't work. So when the draft local plan was put forward, one of the key elements was the process of setting up a master plan. But when you look at that master plan being presented today, there is no significant detail in relation for how it to work. We've heard before, unfortunately, in Paddock Wood, where the planning office will go away, we'll deal with it, we'll look at it, we'll review it, and things will be better. Well, things are not better because the present 3 developments had various conditions imposed, mitigation, and they're not being implemented and they're not working. So when we get the impression that that's going to be there in the future, I personally do not have confidence on that on behalf of Paddock Wood Labour Party. We feel that it's not been looked at in the whole scheme of Tunbridge Wells Borough. If you look at it, Capel and Paddock Wood have got the highest proportion of new housing within the draft local plan. So it's going to have the biggest impact on those 2 communities, Capel and Paddock Wood. So I would ask yourself, the Inspector, to revisit this again and get more detail on the master plan. We've got no input from the utilities, KCC, NHS, just vague assumptions. We'll have a new health centre, a new shopping centre, it'll all integrate, new highways initiatives, how Network Rail will provide new parking, new cycleways, no detail at all. It's just writing on a piece of paper within the draft local plan. And when you look at the comments already made, we all appear to be saying the same thing. Thank you.
Okay. Go to Ms. Piper next, please.
Thank you, sir. For some reason, my video is not working, but I don't know why. Oh, there we are. Thank you, sir. Jane Piper, Barton Wilmot, on behalf of Crest Nicholson to the northwest. You would have seen our reps, which are very much about trying to get a consistent approach to policy. And I'm glad to hear Mr. Shadaravian actually talking about amending it to make it so. I think this is particularly important in terms of the quantum of uses. And for example, employment is not specified. And obviously we are seeing a great deal of employment on this site. And I think that's important, firstly, so we know what the appropriate calculations can be in terms of infrastructure requirements and the provision that they're going to provide as part of the shared infrastructure delivery. And also, I think it would help the council actually monitor their local plan as it goes forward as to what site is providing what amount of development. So very much in favour of quantums being specified. But there is an issue. I mean, the gentleman before me just mentioned the health centre. The health centre is actually mentioned in the David Locke document as being about 0.5 of a hectare. But it's clear that the CCG at the time would not be producing it. Now, that doesn't mean to say, as part of a sustainable development, developers would not want to provide some sort of health facility. But I think that's where a minimum size or a quantum might be useful, and also an indication of uses, bearing in mind that things are changing. And I think this is where our support for the SPD approach is very much there. And I just wanted to sort of raise this now because lots of people have raised it. Since this process started, in the local plan process started in 2016, so much has changed in terms of planning. We've seen a couple of MPPFs, we've had a climate emergency from the council, building beautiful, building for life. There's been more inclusion of mental well-being in things, culminating in the National Design Guide, which is now very much part of the MPPF. We've also had EA flood mitigation modelling changing, and I'm sure we'll come on to that separately. LTN 120, cycle infrastructure, has come in. The Environment Bill with biodiversity net gain, future home standards, the impacts of COVID, the changes to the NHS and towards social prescribing, never mind all the more global aspects. So we do need some flexibility. So we ensure that when this development comes forward within the local plan period, that at the time of the application, it is as good as it can be. So I think there is a difference that needs to be made between the strategic planning policies that needs to set out what is required for this level of development. And that does go into the quantum of uses, and that does need to be consistent. And then what needs to be dealt with in terms of master planning, balancing all of the planning elements on these sites, and the layout of it, and connectivity, and green belt, all those things, flood, all the things that need to be balanced should come through that future design. Now, as you know, Crest Nicholson and Dandara to the west are not as far forward as those developers to the east. But it is that we're still in the strategic sites working group talking to the council, and we will be coming forward at the appropriate time. So, and that, I'm sure we will deal with specific issues as we go through your agenda. But it is clear that some consistency in the policy is required. I mean, one of the aspects that nobody's really mentioned other than employment is the sports and leisure hub, where it seems to be quite a lot of detail has gone into that, which actually isn't evidenced. And I think the council would benefit from making sure that things are evidenced. I mean, there is a quantum, which is great for that use, but it probably goes into too much detail. So and just to support what was said by Miss Ashton earlier, you know, the Crest Nicholson is definitely talking and working with the local council and has no issues with any of these uses. But I'm just thinking from a more strategic point of view, the local plan is 15 years, covers a 15-year period, and actually it will, if you provide quantums, it will actually enable calculations of infrastructure requirements and also then monitoring as these needs come forward. Thank you, sir.
Okay, Mr. Williams. Oh, sorry, Ms. Williams.
Thank you, sir. Carol Williams on behalf of Paddock Wood Town Council. I chair the planning committee. I think some of these points have already been mentioned, but I'd still like to emphasise them. That neither the chairman of town council or myself can remember any mention of extra care provision in the strategic sites working party. And actually there is a need in Paddock Wood for all types of older people's accommodation. Currently, residents who need nursing care or care home type provision have to go out of the town nearest to Tunbridge. And that you know, we've had representations from residents who don't drive, they can't get to visit their partners in care homes in Tunbridge except relying on infrequent buses. So the extra care is an issue. We do have concerns about the parcel on the east coming forward so quickly, particularly ahead of firm guidance on infrastructure. The infrastructure that Redrow and Persimmon are proposing to build is clearly laid out. I've been to 2 presentations now. they've clearly laid out the infrastructure without having that other guidance. And I don't remember any mention of extra care in their development either. But we are in a situation where we've got 3 developments going forward, which were subject to conditions at planning approval. And actually what we're seeing is those conditions not being adhered to when the final approval is being delivered. They're only partly discharged or not discharged at all, particularly in relation to infrastructure such as foul sewage. And that we've seen conditions or promises in relation to roads, the road junction at Badsall Road and Maidstone Road, which was meant to be delivered when Green Lane was developed, and then with these current developments, and there's still some question about whether that will go ahead because KCC are saying they don't have enough money. So we do have concerns about SPDs being used because conditions didn't work, and SPDs just seem to be conditions by another name. And one of the other concerns that we have is that in terms of involvement in the approach to development, we've had an opportunity to consult, yes, on the plans, but one of the problems with that is documents come forward after the consultation period. Documents are drifting onto the website without being clearly announced. So, you know, you have to keep an eye on the website to keep up with the documents. And we've had one consultation event, which was on Zoom. It was very structured. The guidelines for each group to do in the event, you couldn't really comment outside the specific criteria that was set for your group. And half the participants didn't actually want to participate in that event, so didn't treat it seriously because they didn't want any building on land that belongs to Capel. So it was a joint Paddock Wood and Capel event. It was very brief. It wasn't really what I would call consultation. It was a workshop exercise.
I'll stop you there because we did have a session, and this was raised earlier in the examination specifically about the consultation. So I'll stop you there.
Right. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, Mr. Smith.
Apologies, sir. Points I was going to raise have already been raised. To avoid repeating them, I won't.
That's fine.
Contribution. Yeah. I just forgot to remove my hand. My apologies.
No, that's absolutely fine. And that point goes to everybody, really. You know, please don't feel that you have to sort of reiterate a point that's already been made. And one I've noted down, we don't need to have any repetition. Ms. Ashton.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of points, if I may. Just in terms of the actual policy and what it says at the moment, policy STR/SS1 at point 2 actually specifically cross-refers to map 28, which is the master plan, structure plan document that arrives out of the David Locke work. That in it includes land that is already consented as far as land to the east of Paddock Wood is concerned. The area at Church Farm already has consent for 300 units. If the council are minded to amend the policy, and if they are going to also be looking at quantum of development, I think also they need to look at this plan in the context of what is actually now being allocated relative to what's already been consented, because I think that is where you get confusion locally as to why, for example, the land east of Paddock Wood put in an application for a scoping opinion for 1,200 units is because there's already a consent for 300 units within the red line area. And clearly we're not involved in that. That's already consented and is actually already being built out. And I think also that then links into the comments that other representatives were making about the extent of the area that is being included, and also how the SPDs will deal with that. appreciated developers aren't involved in all of the land that is identified within the red line areas. And for example, again, with the land to the east, we have been specifically asked that within the SPD deals with the totality of the area that is being identified, whether or not we have control over it or not. And again, I think that possibly is something that will need to evolve out of the discussion as to how this policy is actually expanded and made clearer so that everybody does actually appreciate what is coming out of it. I think the other point I wanted to make probably has been made by other people about the need for flexibility as well in terms of the actual length of the build programme and the fact that things do change. They change immensely quickly in planning system, as we've noticed over the last few years. So we do need an element of flexibility, but we probably also need an element of clarity for local residents. But in achieving that, we need to make sure that we're actually identifying the proper areas as they now stand, because again, things have moved on since the master plan itself was actually done. Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
Thank you very much. We listened with care, and I've just got, I think, 3 short points. The first point, also from Mr. Shadow-Even, I've sent via Catherine Mills, who sent to the programme officer, the link to the Davis case, and that's available for everyone. But secondly, sir, and whether we like it or not, the result, the result is that there is very little you can do with SPD. And so I think you've got the point that merely referencing to the structure plan that isn't before this EIP is not a way to sidestep it. So I strongly believe once consideration has been given to the legal position that the current fundamental structure of this policy and others that rely on SPD to bring forward the certainty in terms of mix will require a fundamental redrafting. Now that brings me on to the other point I just want to flag up at this stage. So you have heard both today and particularly yesterday the state of the council's position in terms of its evidence in relation to these further matters. It is, in various aspects, in transport and others, at fairly early stages. I think Mr. DeWitt for Tunbridge and Malling highlighted that in terms of transport. The issue, I believe, that will make it more than a drafting exercise and will create real difficulties, and I flag it up, is that the evidence base that it was hived off under SPD for another day and has not been part of this examination to date cannot then just suddenly come back into play with redrafting. So if you redraft and you start abandoning the, which must be done as a matter of law, the SPD process, the issue I flag up for you, sir, is that there will be a lack of sufficient evidence base to support a redrafting. And that's why we believe this issue is fairly fundamental. Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Bell, I think, next.
Sir, there's a bit of a terrible echo.
Shall I mute and go again?
Sorry, sir. Hopefully that's... Sir, bear with me whilst I try and sort this out. If it's okay, I will lower my hand for a moment and come back in after Mrs. Riley.
Okay, we'll go to Maggie Fenton next then, please, from the Cable Parish Council.
Good morning, sir. Maggie Fenton, Cable Parish Council Vice Chair. Actually, most of my points have now been covered by other participants, but I felt it was important, as I represent Capel, that I should speak as well. I have to say that I found your basic question is nothing is clear. Nothing has been clear from the beginning. This council has flip-flopped in its allocations. You know, they've come to us, told us they're building 400 houses around Five Oak Green, then decided they're not. Tudor Village came along. It's quite clear they like the big boys to play with. The mantra has been the whole way through. SSWG, that'll sort it out. Comprehensive Master Plan, that'll sort it out. SPD, that'll sort it out. And as Mr. Jones said, mañana. It's not good enough. There are major, major concerns about any cohesive early infrastructure coming forward. I can't see anything where we have discussed properly anything with this council. We have been told all the way through, this is what we're doing to you. And I think, as Mrs. Williams said, the events like DLA, I don't want to go back on that, totally inappropriate. As Miss Ashton said, East Paddock Wood is forging ahead. This is all going to be piecemeal. That then feeds into your whole infrastructure. What we've seen in Paddock Wood is the Berkeley Homes has gone up by 30%, Church Lane goes up by 30%. If everything that is built out goes up by 30%, it skews all these figures. And I would just like some more clarity. I would have liked a lot more consultation. Basically, I think the whole thing is a pack of cards. The base is completely wrong. I've told them before, the whole council's told them the Sheila was wrong. It was incorrect in a lot of its assessments. The settlement role and function was wrong. The council wouldn't change it. When you build a pack of card house and the bottom layer is not robust, what happens? The whole thing will come crumbling down.
Okay, we'll go to Claire Riley next, and we'll come back to Mr. Bell last, and hopefully the sound's improved. So go to Claire Riley, please.
I just wanted to say the proposal for Paddock Wood is not a garden settlement. It meets none of the criteria for a garden settlement. A garden settlement would involve provision of baseline infrastructure up front, which this plan does not. It's clearly an urban extension with insufficient infrastructure provision. I would like Tunbridge Wells Borough Council to address the point of law that has been made by Mr. Jones, that SPDs cannot be used as development management policies in determining applications. I think that's crucial. And I also feel it is very, very ridiculously late for Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. If they're going to rely on SPDs, it seems appalling that, sitting in these hearings, they are now offering to strengthen these policies. Redrow and Persimmon and Crest Nicholson are already poised with their applications ready to go. So it's clear that what the local community feared, which was that each development would rush to get in first, each developer, sorry, would rush to get in first to avoid sharing the master planning costs, is exactly what is going to happen. This will result in poor development, poor provision of infrastructure, and I feel that this renders the plan unsound. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Mr. Sutton, Chris Sutton, and then we'll go back to Mr. Bell.
Thank you, sir. Chris Sutton, local resident. I live at 2 Eastlands Lane, so I currently look across the fields to Tudorley Brook Farm. So I'd like to make most of my comments later in the morning on flood, highways and Greenbelt, but I just want to share the concern that was raised about some fundamental inaccuracies in the Sheila, and I articulated those in my original response to the plan as regards the area nearest my home. I particularly, just as one example, point out that the plan in section 5.231 talk about the orchards and the ponds in this area between the railway line and the A228. So I'd invite you to come and inspect and view and visit this area. There are no orchards here. There are no ponds here. 90% of the land in this particular area is productive wheat fields. And in regards to the comment about the master planning, I see nothing in the master planning around the transitional protection of the landscape whilst pockets of the development take place. This is a very, very large take of rural land, and you would expect, and it would be impossible to develop it all at once. What are the protections in place to maintain landscape during the transitional period? I see nothing of that in the master plan. Thank you.
Mr. Bell, hopefully, fingers crossed, the sound's okay. Mr. Bell?
So,
It's still echoey. Maybe try without your camera on. So just the audio.
So I think the problem is Mr. Bell is not using earphones, and I think there's feedback coming via the speaker on his computer.
Sir, currently to correct that, I've got my earphones in, and it's not making any difference. So I'm not sure what's going on.
What else is
Can I just come in here, because this often happens at work? Have you got somebody else in the room who's also listening to this?
We do, but
if they turn their sound off, you'll lose the feedback. So if they turn their sound off, both on the screen and on their computer, they need to knock the sound off on their computer as well. You should be able to speak.
Bear with me.
Okay, we'll just give Mr. Bell a moment. If not, we're heading towards a sort of break anyway, so we'll have a comfort break. And
I'm hoping this is better.
No, there's still feedback. What we'll do, Mr. Bell, I'll finish by handing over to the council. I think obviously we've heard a lot now of the same representations anyway, and I think we've got this point quite clear, and the council's got these points quite clear. But we'll offer them a sort of chance to sum up or respond to any points. We'll then have a break. In that break, it might be worthwhile logging out and then logging back in. And I think, as William said as well, just making sure that there's no other interference from sort of other people in the room, etc. So I'll just hand over to the council, then we'll have a break, and in that break, hopefully you can have a look at the technology. And Charlotte, if you can maybe be on hand to help Mr. Bell.
Yes. Yeah, he had an echo yesterday, and I mentioned it, so I'll just see what, and I think he did. There is
it went away yesterday, and it worked absolutely fine all day. So might just be a case of good old fashioned.
I think if he tries logging out, like you suggest, logging out and logging back in, that might help, because I think he did try everything else. So
okay, we'll hand back to the council, then we'll have a sort of comfort break and give Mr. Bell time to try and sort it out. So anything from the council then on all what we're really to the first 2 points throughout the agenda, isn't it? Is it clear decision makers about the mix of uses, but also goes into the second point about ensuring that these developments, goes back to what we talked about yesterday, isn't it? You've got this vision. How do you ensure this comes forward in a coherent, comprehensive manner, avoiding piecemeal development of individual parcels? And that goes on to some of the infrastructure, which we'll go on to talk about. So I think you've already sort of perhaps indicated that yes, this policy does need a bit of a think about how this is going to be effective and thus justified and sound, really. But anything else you wanted to?
No, we accept that the policy needs to be looked at again in terms of its structure and requirements. And I will, of course, take on board the point Mr. Jones has made about the status of SPD. I'm well aware of that, of course, but nonetheless, I'm grateful for his intervention there and his assistance. We refute that there isn't the evidence base as it were, to support any drafting changes. So I take issue with Mr. Jones in relation to that. The master planning is robust. It has shaped the policy, especially in terms of the disposition of development and the infrastructure requirements. And the DLA master plan actually identifies the location of development throughout the allocated area comprehensively, along with infrastructure requirements. So the evidence is there before the examination in terms of infrastructure provision and other assessments that support the allocation. The question is how best to give effect to that through the policy itself, and that will be the subject of further consideration once this session is completed. I may need to come back and deal with this in more detail later on, but I'll just leave it at that for the time being, if I may.
Okay, we'll go to mid-morning break then. We'll have a 15-minute break until 11:30. And yeah, hopefully in that break, Mr. Bell, I think probably the best thing to do, log out, reset things, and then obviously if everybody else just keeps the microphones turned off and cameras turned off, but if Mr. Bell, you try and log out, reset things, and then Charlotte, if you can maybe be on hand to help Mr. Bell, and hopefully, as I said, it seemed to work fine yesterday, so I'm pretty confident we can get this resolved. So we'll take a break and we'll resume at 11:30 then, please. Thank you.
Hi, Charlotte.
Oh, hi. Oh, hello. Hi. Would you like to? That's much clearer.
Oh, hang on, it's doing something strange.
The video's not on. There you are.
There we go. So is that nice and clear?
That seems perfect. It seems fine.
Not sure what it is. I mean, I do use headphones, so I have kind of Apple AirPods.
Same.
I tried them with and without, and it's not. But it feels like it's working now.
It's fine. Yeah, that's strange. I mean, maybe logging back in just helped.
I turn mine on.
Yesterday.
Does that make a difference if I come on?
So I'm in the room.
Oh, yes, it does.
Fenton.
Yes, that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
okay. I'll mute again.
Maggie probably needs to have headphones also.
So we muted it before and it just didn't seem to do anything, but I think we seem to have resolved it now because it's not echoing, is it at all?
Yeah, I think you'll be fine because if you're not speaking at the same time, which you won't be, then it's just both remembering to keep your mics off. Yeah. It's fine now. Yeah, you seem fine. So that is the echo. Yeah, okay. I think you're good. You're good.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's past, so we'll resume and continue. Mr. Bell, fingers crossed. Technology's working.
Sir, I think it is.
I think it is. Good.
There we go.
Okay, so we skipped you out last time. We're going to move on to the flooding, but I just obviously the opportunity now if you'd want to add any additional points, just that last of topic that haven't already been mentioned.
So yes, it's just a short rounding up, and it's largely to do with the second bullet point your question too. I mean, essentially, Safe People came into this being completely unclear as to how any mixed uses were going to be provided. Having heard what the councils had to say today, if anything, we're even less clear now. And indeed, the policy in relation to this site, the site we dealt with yesterday, appears just to be a bit of a mess, to put it quite lightly. So at point of submission of the local plan, it doesn't appear the evidence was there to justify soundness, and now you're constantly hearing from the council in response to the rightly difficult points that you yourself and others are putting to that the council is happy to modify and amend policies to try and make good points that we shared before the plan was submitted. In doing that, if the council permitted to do that, it undermines a fundamental principle in local plan making, and that's the engagement of the local community, who aren't then asked to consider and respond to SPDs where there are very kind of clear and significant points being made in respect to how development will come forwards. And one of our concerns about this, and this is more for the second bullet point, is in respect to the phasing of key infrastructure and how that is going to ensure that development comes forward in a coherent and comprehensive manner, in particular in relation to the housing that is proposed here. You have a situation here where you have a site where there is a risk of multiple developers dealing with both SS1 and SS3, and it just doesn't feel that the approach to them kind of effectively working together and how the planning applications to be dealt with have been properly considered, and indeed in respect of the infrastructure needs to help facilitate these developments. The local plan doesn't contain any guidance on this, and so we would say quite clearly on that basis that you should be looking at recommending that these allocations are removed from the local plan if you allow the local plan to continue in any form. Very briefly on the SP points, I'm grateful to Mr. Jones, who made some of the points that I was going to make. Now that Mr. Jones has sent a link to the judgment, we would encourage you to read what Mr. Justice Gilbert says in respect of the SPD considered in that case.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on. So I want to, in this next session up to probably lunch break, look at some of the flood risk and drainage issues that have been raised by representatives. And there's two parts to this. So as set out on the agenda, the first part is to start to unpick and consider some of the different options that council's considered for development in the areas subject to flood risk. And I think we're probably going to be mainly talking about the parcel of land to the west, and whether or not that will actually avoid flood risk to people and property. And the second part of it is whether or not it's consistent with national planning policy. So that second part of the conversation is about the sequential test, exception tests, and whether it accords with the NPPF. And I know that's a point that Mr. Hayes has been making throughout. So the first part of this then, trying to understand what is proposed in the areas that are subject to flood risk, and trying to understand from the council why that is justified given that these are subject to flooding. So really sort of opening question for the council really. So what options have you looked at for the areas that are subject to flood risk? And why do you think the plan is justified in allocating these areas for development?
Thank you, sir. Firstly, in terms of looking at the options which were subject to detailed work undertaken by the David Locke Associates and supporting team. I'm going to ask Ms. Cave to provide comment on that with support from JBA Consulting, and I will then come back on the other points.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. I'd like to first of all touch on the question you raised about options. The master planning work that was undertaken to inform the structure plan was informed by a review of site constraints and opportunities, including flood zone mapping. If you have the report available, you'll see, for example, on page 95, the type of flood mapping that was produced to support our work. We produced a series of options for the structure plan before arriving at a recommended option. And as you'll see from the report, if you'll just give me a moment, option 3 considered the possibility of no residential development within any EA designated flood zones. So we gave particular attention to where it was possible to identify land that could accommodate built development, whilst having due regard to the need to avoid land that would be prone to flooding. In the event, the option 3, which was the land, no development within EA designated flood zones, was rejected because it was felt that it took an overly cautious approach to development outside, to no development within any flood zone land. So the areas that we coloured buff on the plan are those areas which are considered suitable for some development. And that affected our calculation of the capacity of the site and its ability to accommodate the volume of development that was identified by the council at the Reg 18 stage. During the master planning process, we had extensive discussions with my colleague, Mr. Gibson from JBA Consulting, who's here around the table with us, and he can talk in a little bit more about some of the detailed technical considerations that were taken on board. But just to say, really in conclusion, we did give full attention to that matter during the course of the master planning.
So just by way of clarification, and just to go back to what you just said. So option 3, and these are the options that are set out in the master plan, strategic sites master plan document. So option 3, you said that avoided residential development in areas subject to flooding. Is that correct?
Yes. So it's
avoid all development. Was it just residential?
Well, just residential development. Right. There is obviously open space requirements fall within flood zone land, as one would assume, including the sports hub as well.
Okay, so you said there that you looked at option 3, but you said it was rejected because it was overly cautious and it didn't meet the capacity that the councillor set out at the Reg 18 stage.
Well, it reduced our ability to achieve that capacity across the draft allocation sites as a whole. So the option 3, when compared to option 1, which is the favoured option, delivers 610 homes fewer. So the capacity is reduced because no development is identified within the flood zones.
Okay. And do you think that's justified? Do you think that's appropriate, given what we know about what national planning policy tells us with regard to, development in flood zones and taking a sequential approach? avoiding areas subject to flood risk?
I think it is appropriate, yes. There's no development here within flood zone 3, obviously, which is something that we deliberately sought to avoid in all options, including the preferred option, option 1. So we're confident that that can be delivered.
Okay.
Hand over to my colleague. Sorry, sir.
So you got these different options. So option, we know that option 3 avoids residential development in areas of flood risk. So
Yes.
so by definition, then option 1 must include development within areas subject to flood risk.
Yes.
So what's the justification for that then? What is proposed to justify that approach?
I'll hand over to my colleague, Mr. Gibson, who's going to provide some more technical information, if that's all right.
Hello. Excuse me. Hello there, sir. Can I confirm you can hear me okay? So coming through, marvellous. So Ben Gibson from JBA Consulting, supporting the council and DLA with flood risk matters. For fear of straying into your kind of second and third points on the process that's been followed and so on, I think it's worth stressing that the council and DLA have been considering the sequential approach to placement of development throughout. And whilst it's acknowledged that for their option 1, some development is placed within flood zone 2, well, the council or DLA could speak for the need for that, but that is an appropriate form of development, which is a more vulnerable development category within the NPPF kind of flood risk vulnerability table. It's table 3. So yes, one could say that, well, option 3 should be preferred because of being exclusively in flood zone 1. There is a wider need, and that development that is proposed is appropriate in terms of that vulnerability classification.
And so if I could draw that together. So at an earlier session, when we talked about the overall strategy and the consideration of Paddock Wood, as to why the council had considered it through the sequential test, and we explained that within taking, for example, the land to the west of Paddock Wood, which is in the east of Capel Parish, there are areas of flood zone 3, there are areas of flood zone 2, but there are substantial areas of flood zone 1, and the council, informed by the strategic flood risk assessments, considered that developments could be allocated there, and accordingly that was a suitable location to consider through the sustainability appraisal for development of the strategy and looking at options that fed into the development of the strategy. It was then through the master planning work that the different options were considered, which Ms. Cave has outlined there, and the council's view was that whilst the suggested option, or the option that ultimately was taken forward, included both land in flood zones 1 and flood zones 2, given that the development of residential developments within flood zone 2 without basements is still appropriate, combined with the consideration of the wider sustainability wider sustainability elements that have to be considered as part of considering growth, that it was right to continue with the allocation, which I should say was refined down, and the numbers were refined between draft local plan and pre-submission local plan stage, partly taking account of the work around flooding, to take it forward on flood zone 1 and flood zone 2 where it would still be appropriate developments, and to deliver a lower amount of housing, but still the amount of housing which would allow for and be part of the transformational growth at Paddock Wood. So overall, the council considered, so that is to try and bring together both what happened before the master planning work, then the options that were looked at through the master planning work, informed at all times through detailed flood assessment work, through engagement with the Environment Agency, and I would draw attention to the representations from the Environment Agency and Kent County Council as the lead local flood authority, and the conclusions in the Statement of Common Ground in respect of flooding, that the council considered it was appropriate to allocate the sites at Paddock Wood, with the particular example of land to the west of Paddock Wood.
So we'll sort of come back onto this issue of the sequential test. I know that we talked about this in great detail already, and the sort of pure principle of it. So in effect, you're looking at a parcel of land. It's within flood zones 1, 2, and 3. You looked at an option which only had development in flood zone 1, but you discounted that. And again, we'll come back onto the reasons for that in terms of the sequential test. What is proposed then, because this is something that we haven't discussed at other sessions, what is proposed then to make this parcel of land safe from the risk of flooding, but also to prevent the development from causing increased flood risk elsewhere?
So this is where I'll ask Mr. Gibson to provide comment on those measures.
Sure. So perhaps if I start with the fact that the sequential approach to the placement and development is going quite a long way in terms of managing potential future risk to people that will be on the site, but also third parties, so moving it to the lowest flood risk zones. There is, of course, drainage requirements and so on set out in Kent County Council guidance and SUD's manual guidance that I'm sure that refers to, in terms of what provision must be on site in terms of managing runoff rates, but also allowing for managing existing flow routes and so on. So that a lot of that detail will come out of the detailed applications, and if they don't satisfactorily manage that, I understand will be rejected in accordance with planning practice and so on. I'll add that climate change considerations have been included in all of the assessments, so starting from the level 1 strategic flood risk assessment to adding more detail through the level 2 SFRA and the master planning work that's been conducted. And those allowances were higher than are currently applicable according to the Environment Agency's guidance. So the council have been very mindful of future flood risk and also considering ways in which that could, any changes could be managed. It's in the technical note, which is 33.66F that supports the master plan. That the approach taken.
Yes, what's proposed then? What's development in this parcel going to have to do then?
The development in the parcel will develop in the lowest flood risk zones and deliver drainage and surface water management strategies that appropriately manage runoff from that falls onto the site and not disrupting overland flow routes to the adverse impact of others.
Okay, so how is it going to do that?
It's my understanding that planning policy, as the detailed applications come forward, will make that a requirement, and therefore that will be a consideration of approving or rejecting the application.
well, is there a reasonable prospect that, obviously you talked about strategies, what I want to know is what actually is required to make development in these zones acceptable, and whether or not there's a realistic prospect of that occurring. Because it's all right to say, well, at a plan application stage, the council could refuse planning permission, but then the plan's not effective. It's not delivering its objectives, so it's not justified.
Okay, so the council can come in if they would like, but very specific requirements of, placing specific drainage features and so on in specific locations has not been set out. That would be, to my belief, a level of detail that is beyond what is necessary. The council have satisfied themselves through work that has been done that things like preserving flow routes through the site can improve and appropriately manage any changes as it's brought forward. So very specific details are not there at this stage, but indeed I think that's appropriate for the place that we're at.
Okay, question then to the same question to the council. What's actually proposed then in this western parcel to mitigate the impacts of flood risk and prevent flood risk worsening elsewhere? Because one of the questions I asked at the sessions in May was about, okay, yeah, you could take this sequential approach. So you could have a much larger parcel of land, and then you have a much larger parcel of land, and within it there's pockets of areas of land that don't flood. So you could put development in those areas that don't flood and say, we're avoiding the flood risk areas. But that wasn't the response I got, I don't think, at that stage from the council. It was, well, actually, there is some development going within areas of flood risk, but there's other engineering works that we're doing, which is going to prevent these dwellings from flooding and also give wider improvements to flooding elsewhere. So it's that I'm trying to understand as to what actually is being proposed here.
Thank you, sir. So the in terms of those works to ensure that there is that the sites outside of flood zone 1 will be safe, include improved conveyancing, enhanced or new channels set out, and some of these or these matters are included in the strategic flood risk assessments too. Raised groundworks where relevant, raised platforms where relevant, groundworks, and sustainable urban drainage systems. And I'll come back to the betterment points shortly. So these works, and this is where density of development as well within the parcels is important, would avoid overland flow routes. They would be at a density which the county council, as the lead local flood authority, is satisfied can provide suitable, sustainable urban drainage systems at too denser developments. The ability to provide those would be weakened. These were considered in the strategic sites master planning and infrastructure study. The timescales for delivering them are identified within that, and through the engagement with the Environment Agency and Kent County Council as the lead local flood authority, the statutory bodies has confirmed that at this stage, and given the level of detail expected at local plan stage, that they have no objection to the inclusion of the these allocations at this point. If I could then turn to just let me find the map, which is the on page 150, the essentially the plan, the master plan from the structure plan, you'll see a green elliptical shape in the northeastern corner of the southwestern parcel, and that is there is a flood route into Paddock Wood, existing areas of Paddock Wood, at times of flood, which occurs from that parcel to the southwest, through the provision of flood defences in that location, that essentially closes off that flood route, that flood path, and would deliver the betterment to areas of Paddock Wood by reducing water flow into that location. And again, that is one of the that's one of the matters that we have discussed and has been factored into KCC as the lead local flood authority and the Environment Agency's representations.
So where does the water go? It's a blunt question. You've sort of said, well, yeah, okay, you've got this part of Paddock Wood that floods, and you know, we're going to stop it flooding. Well, how are you going to do that? Where's the water going to go?
So it would be stored within the southwestern part of the site. The southwestern portion of Paddock Wood, and then flows north to so the flood route, or the flow of water is from south to north, and would then progress further north on towards the River Medway. So it would be held and would then flow, as I say, from south to north towards the wetland park, which is identified again, referring to page 150 of the local plan, in the structure plan, to the very north of the structure, to the very north of Paddock Wood. And I'll ask Ms. Cave and Mr. Gibson to just add anything, supplement anything there.
So how does that work? Is that where the railway line cuts across?
Yes, that's right. So the particular characteristics of the western site at Paddock Wood are such that the green infrastructure strategy will probably form the dominant land use within any development coming forward. The total area that we're looking at is 170 hectares, just shy of 170 hectares. It's anticipated that development capacity within that is actually less than 60 hectares. So it's clear that the vast majority of the land here is going to be given over to green infrastructure. And we would expect a SUD strategy to come forward as part of the design of that green infrastructure, with a process of SUDs and attenuation features to control the flow of water, to control the overland flow and deviate it away from existing Paddock Wood through the introduction of that flood management measure, to control the flow beneath the railway and gradually travel north to a new wetland area, which not only provides opportunities for water attenuation, but also wetland-based habitat as well, as part of the overall betterment of the development. So it does require a very carefully sort of engineered and designed solution for that. But the expectation is that there is more than adequate land within the site to be able to deal with that at the more detailed stage.
So the area that's south of the railway line,
Yes.
There's an area south of the railway line, and within the what you said, obviously the water flows sort of up through that land at the moment, and then there's an issue with flooding around Paddock Wood and where the existing sort of development is. And what this development is going to do is going to say, well, we're going to stop that, and we're going to sort of, in effect, make the water go further north, presumably underneath the railway line, towards this sort of new wetland habitat area to the north of the railway line. So just in sort of quite layman's engineering terms, presumably, how are you going to get that? How are you going to stop the water flowing into areas of Paddock Wood and divert it then under the railway line to the north? How are you going to do that? And presumably, are Network Rail sort of happy with this suggestion?
I'll defer to the council on the point about Network Rail's involvement, because they have been speaking with Network Rail. I think some of the conceptual ideas that were discussed at the early master planning stage include changes to landform to cut off the overland flow routes into Paddock Wood. So that might be, for example, mounding, earth mounding. Mr. Gibson can probably give a greater range of potential technical solutions, but there would need to be a form of construction to actually cut off that overland flow route, and that would need to be factored into the drainage strategy that's brought forward as part of any planning application for this land.
Perhaps if I may add a couple of points. So the green oval that's displayed on that infrastructure plan map, that is the location of a key overland flow route where water comes from the south, flows in the low ground through that parcel and spreads eastward to the south of the railway line. And the strategic flood risk assessment identified that if that flow route can be limited or stopped entirely, then there is betterment to the existing areas of Paddock Wood. In terms of what might feature there, I don't think it's a case of pushing all of that water northwards and preventing it going eastwards kind of without attenuation. I anticipate the expectation is that water would be stored or to some degree to the south of the railway line, and therefore attenuating the flows that pass downstream, such that after the flood event, that flow rate can that is manageable and can be passed through the railway line can then be released later. That will have prevented some of the eastward spread of water, providing betterment to areas of Paddock Wood. I believe discussions are still ongoing in terms of the sort of event size that is targeted to. I understand that areas of Paddock Wood have flooding issues in relatively frequent events, and that indeed may be where efforts are best targeted. But accepting that in the very large magnitude events, so we talk about our flood zone 3A and 2 events, so that would be a 1 in 100 year event and a 1 in 1,000 year event, so very rare but large. It may be that, as I say, emphasis is better on the more frequent events that are flooding.
Yes, just on the Network Rail point then, just as a point of clarity, should I can go back and look at this through various statements of common. So firstly, is there a statement of common ground with Network Rail?
Yes, sir, there is. It is CD 3.132. And so what I would do is draw your attention to the specific part of that, which talks about fluvial flood management. I'm fairly sure that culverts will be mentioned by others around the virtual table. And there is specific, the council is working closely with Network Rail and other authorities, DTC partners such as Kent County Council on the culverts element, and paragraph 4.21 of the Statement of Common Ground sets out that both parties are continuing to work proactively in the consideration of flood management and to look to find solutions to reduce flood impacts for existing and future residents. So the council has engaged positively and proactively with Network Rail. They are continuing, and Network Rail are positive in that work. They are part of a. Oh, sorry, I'll just ask Miss Young to provide further detail.
Just to add, through the Strategic Sites and Delivery team, we've been working with Upper Medway Internal Drainage Board, KCC as Lead Local Flood Authority, the Environment Agency, and Network Rail, and Paddock Wood Town Council as well, as a sort of a culvert working group, if you like, to discuss the issues. And that's predominantly on east of Paddock Wood rather than west Paddock Wood, because there have been issues to do with blocked drains, as everyone understands, and perhaps Network Rail. I think the query was whether or not Network Rail were maintaining them as they should. Everyone's have been exploring that. We're working together, and actually stemming from those discussions, what has been agreed and what is seeking to take place very shortly and become a regular event is a specific Paddock Wood and Five Oak Green culvert working group that takes place regularly in light of the strategic growth that is being planned to monitor this situation and to ensure that the maintenance is in place. And KCC we've spoken to alongside separately as lead local flood authority, and they are confident that the infrastructure is there and that to deliver this drainage and the growth, and they're comfortable that it's a maintenance issue that can be resolved and will be resolved moving forward.
So this would require, yes, this would require culverts under Network Rail's existing infrastructure, then, i.e. the railway line, to then let this redirected water flow south to north. Yeah.
Existing culverts are not new.
So that would be 3 existing ones. Okay. A part of this as well, and it's within the Strategic Sites master planning document, which talks about raising land. Let's get to the relevant paragraph 5.45 says raised platforms of approximately 1 metre are required for around 11 hectares of development on the western side of Paddock Wood to ensure floodwaters remain outside of residential areas and to ensure betterment of Paddock Wood. The comprehensive approach to flood management requires coordination between developers north and south of the railway line to achieve a mutually beneficial result. Just talk to me a bit more about what that envisages. Is this essentially raising the land across areas where new housing will be built by 1 metre?
The reference at paragraph 5.45 is specifically in relation to development areas, so areas that would be subject to residential development, not the green infrastructure.
Yeah, so it's talking about basically, 11 hectares, pretty significant area of land. In effect, earthworks to raise that land up by 1 metre.
Yes, that's the technical guidance that we were given.
So that's what's going to be required. Okay. So a couple of questions that sort of stem out of that. Has the council given any consideration to the effects of having to do that then, be it on, first of all, viability, but also on, things like character and appearance? What's this going to look like?
There hasn't been any detailed assessment of any visual impact insofar as I'm aware, because we're at a very early stage in the design process, although it would be right to say that when we undertook the master planning work, we did communicate quite effectively with the council's landscape officer, who unfortunately isn't able to be at the examination, with regard in particular to the impact of development on views from the AONB. So those sort of broad considerations were part of the mix that was taken into account during the master planning exercise. There hasn't been any specific assessment in relation to visual impact, as I said. In terms of viability, I think that there is an expectation that ground preparation will be needed to undertake development here, and that was factored into the rates that were applied to the viability modelling, as far as I'm aware.
And I think, sir, it will probably be helpful for Mr. Gibson here to just provide some clarity around this. So, in terms of the broad scale and the work that that was undertaken as part of the master planning, obviously envisaged some areas of groundwork as referenced and at the paragraph and as included and costed, but in practice it's more nuanced than that, as I understand, and I'll ask Mr. Gibson to just provide some further comment on that.
Sure. So in respect of raising development up above flood levels, Environment Agency requirements are that to support with the exception test, making sure things are safe, that the dwellings themselves are raised above the flood level, and that's typically the 100-year event with the effects of climate change. The detail that would come out of applications is that it's possible not all of those areas that need to be raised to be termed platforms, and certainly overland flow routes would look to be preserved, and that's what the modelling that has supported the SFRA and master planning has shown, that if we preserve those routes and allow water to flow through it, and off-site impacts can be appropriately managed.
Okay, let's hear some thoughts on what we've heard so far. We'll stick to sort of the first two bullet points. And Mr. Hayes, I know that you've got comments around sort of what National Plan Policy tells us in terms of the actual principle of selecting this site, which we've discussed and we will come on to. But let's just take some comments on what we've heard so far. So we'll go to Claire Riley first, please.
Hi. We've taken the opportunity, the infrastructure delivery plan relies on the technical note provided by JBA Consulting, which we've taken the opportunity to review. It admits in there that there is a model, that I don't know where to begin with this. Quoting from this, it says, initial modelling of master plan layouts options 1 and 3 showed unexpected increase in flood depths in some areas of Paddock Wood. The findings in the report indicate that both options 1 and 3 increase flood depths. There is reference to raising the entire footprint, as you have discussed, above the maximum flood level for the residential areas. But in the technical note, it says that whilst that's been considered, it actually says that the simplistic approach used to represent the residential areas, i.e. raising their entire footprint above the maximum level, has not been modelled. So that suggestion hasn't actually been modelled at all. Any development is reliant on maintenance of flood mitigation features in perpetuity. There's no provision for that in any of the modelling, the SFRAs or the infrastructure delivery plan. It's not clear how any of the outflows of this modelling will pass the railway line to get into the Medway. We've provided you, unfortunately, after the deadline, we provided you with our correspondence with the Town Council's correspondence with Network Rail, where they make it absolutely clear that the culverts as stand, so there's no new culverts, the culverts as stand were designed for agricultural fields. They were not designed for residential developments. And commenting specifically on the technical note, paragraph 2.1.1, the last paragraph, if the Medway is up, it's in spate, which it is every winter, Paddock Wood does not drain. The water backs up and simply stops the area, the water draining from south to north. Paragraph 2.2, last paragraph, there refers to depths of drainage channels. There are no drainage channels in Paddock Wood that are 4 metres wide at the top and 2 metres wide at the bottom, and 500 millimetres deep as per the modelling. Therefore, this is not representative of the drainage around Paddock Wood. Page 8 of the technical note shows a drawing. Conveyance routes are shown going through Church Farm from the land east of the same. It is known that the attenuation and mitigation features provided at Church Farm are only provided to mitigate against flooding from that same development, not for any other purpose. They are required for runoff on that site only, with no future development headroom. Referring to paragraph 3.2.1, Southwest Paddock Wood, no apparent betterment is provided by the proposal modelling for the existing development. There's reference to relatively small reduction in flood depths. This will only work too, again, if the features are maintained. There is no mention there also of the railway constriction. As regards Network Rail, I couldn't find this statement of common ground. I've got the reference now and I'll look it up. One thing I would say, there's Ms Young referred to the working group that's been set up by KCC as the lead flood risk authority to talk about culverts. That has met once. On that occasion, Paddock Wood Town Council were excluded from that meeting, despite the fact we'd said that we would attend. And we were sent the agenda on the morning of the actual meeting, which was too late for anyone to make the meeting. The second meeting that was due to take place has not happened because they couldn't sort out some dates. So I wouldn't rely too strongly on that. But I just think that if you actually read the findings of the technical note and its conclusions, it is quite clear. There's been no detailed, there's no, as I think you picked up on, you were saying, okay, how are you going to actually manage the water? How will you deal with the water? And that has not been addressed. And we're back to what I think that Troy Hayes has mentioned previously at these hearings, is that the sequential test has not been done. It has not been done by JBA and it has not been done by Tunbridge Wells Borough Council, and therefore everybody is in breach of the guidance in the National Planning Policy Framework, which says if you're going to build in areas of flood zone, you had to perform the sequential and exception test, and that has simply not occurred. But as I say, that was I'm happy to send these notes that we've made on the technical note over to the programme officer so that you can review them, because I know that I speak much too fast and I jabber, and it'd be far better if I'd sent them before. But as I say, we didn't have time until the last couple of days to review the technical notes. So I apologise for bringing this up at this late stage. Thank you.
No, that's okay. I've got notes of those and I'll certainly look at those documents that are available. Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, sir. I will try to avoid talking about the sequential test because I think we are going to get onto that. I think the key issue. I think why it's difficult for the council to explain what they're proposing and kind of give a coherent answer is. I don't think that the evidence base doesn't really lead you to putting development at Paddock Wood. So everything that they're talking about is trying to make these sites work, trying to retrofit it so that it's the flood risk isn't going to be an issue, but unfortunately it is, and they haven't really dealt with all the infrastructure requirements and mitigation that would be required. They just simply don't have the detail on it, I think, which was plainly clear from the responses that you received. On just a couple points of clarification as well. I think David Locke Associates mentioned that the option 3 was completely outside of zones 2 and 3, but I believe that it does actually include some residential development north of the railway line in option 3. So I may want to have a look at that to confirm. I think we heard as well from the flood risk consultants, they talk about being mindful of the sequential test. not actually having undertaken one. And they also talk about, you know, the requirements are just going to come through planning conditions on a planning application, and that they're going to require a drainage strategy. Well, a drainage strategy is required for pretty much any planning application of any significance. So I don't think there's anything really special about that. I also sort of come back to the point about, you know, cumulative impact, the need to look at the cumulative impact of all of these areas within Paddock Wood, not just on a kind of site-by-site basis, and the fact that, you know, there hasn't been any visual impact work done looking at the kind of, you know, raised platforms, although the council did LVIAs for you know, effectively the rest of the area around Tunbridge Wells. There hasn't been any of that type of work done for Paddock Wood. I think overall it's really lacking any detail. It's really difficult to have any confidence in what the council's proposing and in this local plan policy. Thank you very much.
Okay, Ms. Piper.
Thank you, sir. I'm just going to quickly just respond on that sequential test point. I'm at a loss about hearing this being repeated. I think it's quite clear, actually, in level 1 SFRA and level 2 SFRA that sequential test has been done. So it is there and therefore appropriate. And then what's happened is, as time has gone by and things have progressed into looking at more detail, a more detailed hydraulic model was developed by the EA, and that is the model that DLA have used in its master planning document. So that changes significantly the look of this site in terms of flooding from the original EA plans for maps for flood for planning. So and that's what's being utilised. What I did want to say is just to emphasise from a developer point of view on behalf of Crest that what Ms. Cave has said is absolutely right. There are options here. There is plenty of land on here to make those options work. And actually the work that Crest consultants have been doing has taken that even further forward and has looked at other options, which looks at how it can deal with different elements. Now, that just to explain, we do have the fluvial issues from the south, but there's also fluvial issues from the River Medway to the north, and they do meet to the north part of our site. So just to give you that information, that we are looking at all of that, and the work that the consultants have done for Crest show that actually it can, all the standards that are required by the LLFA, by the Environment Agency, can be achieved on within the Crest controlled land. So, and that will be done primarily as far as the development is concerned by platforms. We aren't looking at anything near a metre. We are looking at platforms of 0.5 or 0.75. So visually they will be less intrusive, but we're not going to be able to make that assessment until we know exactly where the development is going to go in comparison to the other aspects and other land uses of the whole scheme. And obviously in part of that, we need to look at connectivity, we look at walkability, we need to look at the sustainability and the green belt and all those other issues. So it is very much about how it's dealt with as a whole. But one of the things I would say is the information that DLA worked to was based on the 35% climate change that the EA gave at the time. That figure since July 2021 has been reduced in regard to the River Medway because there's been a more refined catchment considerations there. So that is now 27%. So those figures that DLA have worked to, and indeed our initial work, is more conservative than it could be. That said, and literally last month in May, surface water climate change figures have gone up slightly from 40% to 45%. And this, I think, adds to our arguments that this is why it's important that master planning is dealt with through SPD, because these things do change quite regularly, and we need to take that into account. That does not mean to say that what the council have done, which is wholly appropriate for this stage in the local plan process, is unsound in any way. That has been done. They have shown that it can work. The land is large enough, not just to deal with flood, but also to deal with greenbelt issues as well. And then further than that, you also have the surface water drainage strategy that will come as a result of development. And at the moment, our consultants are working on a very high percentage of impermeability, 70%. But given the amount of open space we have, then actually that is likely to be reduced quite significantly. In terms of the betterment issues and the water coming through the pipes under the railway, the strategy that Crest consultants have looked at is very much about creating additional flow to take the water from the existing culverts and push them through the site. Now that does mean that they will go through, they'll be slowed down, they will be the water courses will be maintained, they'll be widened, and in fact there will be a new one east, and this is just one of the options that's being considered at the moment. So and the idea is that that water will flow through and go towards the north before it in effect meets what potential flood could come from the Medway. So I just want to say, from a practical point of view, everything that the council has done, JBA has done, and that's been tested through our consultants. The work that DLA have done has been tested through our consultants and as a team, is all very doable, is all very reasonable in coming forward. And as I say, there are points that at the point of local plan, the appropriate work has been done by the council, and then it's appropriate that we can take that forward and work it out in more detail. And then any of the assessments will come together through that process.
So Ms. Piper, as part of your client's sites and taking that forward, have you spoken to Network Rail about the feasibility of water flows under the railway?
Not yet, sir. We are at very early stages, so we're saying we're just optioneering at the moment. So that is definitely something we'll be looking to do when we start the pre-application process with the council and the statutory consultees that will be part of that process. But we are not quite there yet.
Okay, Mr. Sutton.
Thank you. We are, of course, talking about development in the lowest point of the whole borough, of the whole of Tunbridge Wells borough, in terms of this whole site. Yeah, so naturally, it's a curious choice for development focused on the lowest point in the borough. And I would also say, as a local resident, I have not been consulted on any of the issues by the various people who said they've been doing consulting in terms of the impact. Bring back to 20th December 2020, that was the last major flood in this area. And the biggest impact of the flood was at the point where Easton's Lane crosses Chudley Brook. The level of the flooding was, in my judgment, danger to life and limb. I would not have crossed the bridge during the extent of that flood. It was a really strong force of nature. But what actually happens in terms of the overland runoff, because this is one of the main flooding points, is that just before the bridge, the main overland route is across the field, which is bounded on the north by Easton's Lane and on the west by Chudley Brook. It is that field, and that field gets very extensive flooding. It becomes a river, and I'm really surprised at the comment by the DLA correspondent that the areas in Buff are safe areas. It's that field which is shown as Buff. That is the most at-risk flooding field, and I just don't understand the logic why the most at-risk field has been shown as Buff, and therefore suitable for development. That's just, I just don't get the logic of that colouring. Just moving on then. In terms of the raised platforms, interesting comment that check the visibility from the AONB area. That involves standing up on the ridge line about 3 miles away. So if that's the test on impact for landscape of a raised platform, it's not really I think a sufficient test to check it from there. And then I have a comment about the impact on existing housing, specifically 1, 2, and 3 Eastlands cottages, which are all essentially 19th century buildings. What is the provision to put them onto raised platforms to prevent the flooding? Our house, 2 Eastlands Cottage, didn't get flooded, but it was a matter of millimeters away. And the reason it didn't get flooded was the field to the south, the one I've mentioned, absorbed all the water. But it really was a case of millimeters from our front door. And then my final point, sir, would be around the betterment value. To me, as a resident of the borough and as a ratepayer in the borough, it was a problem in Paddock Wood, south of the railway line, from existing flooding to existing properties. I'd expect the council to get on and sort that anyway. It shouldn't be a precondition or a justification for this transformational development north of the railway line. I just don't see the link between what the council should be doing anyway and the justification for the transformational development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. People keep moving across on my screen. Tony Whetstone next.
Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. Yes, good morning. My name is Anthony Whetstone. I'm the owner of DPC 19 as noted on the Sheila document. I'd like to first of all thank Mr. Birkinshaw and his team for allowing me the opportunity to personally address this formal hearing on a matter which is very important to me and my family. Whilst my planning advisors, Kemba, Loudon, Williams, you heard earlier, have made suitable representations during the Regulation 19 process in respect of this flooding matter, I just wanted to make my own feelings known, much like Mr. Sutton, not from a policy or a procedural point of view, but from a personal, really affected local residents' point of view. Just by way of background, I, along with my wife, live at Tudley Brook Farm, which is the lowest lying property. I mentioned the lowest lying property within the proposed Paddock Wood Northwest expansion area. The property abuts the Tudley Brook stream at its junction with the A228 to the north of Paddock Wood. It's been our private home for 23 years. Regrettably, the property is prone to flooding, and in conjunction with formal advice from civil engineers and working with the Environment Agency and other statutory bodies, we have now installed a full flood mitigation, drainage and pumping solution to protect our home. We had to do that, we had no other choice. Whilst the system operates very well, we do still suffer from leaching from the adjoining Tudley Brook stream when water levels run high. This impacts our use of the garden areas from time to time throughout the year. At a personal level, we're extremely nervous that the proposed development around Paddock Wood will add materially to the flooding risk at our home. And I personally just don't want to put my wife and children through that additional fear and worry again. As happened last time around, it was very real. My wife still suffers sleepless nights during periods of inclement weather and regularly asks me if we should move our possessions to higher ground. I apologise. Our personal flood mitigation system has not been designed to cover the additional water runoff that it will inevitably flow through Tudley Brook. As we've heard, it flows north and we are the most northerly point as part of this planned expansion, which will be absolutely immense. Being located at the furthest downstream point of the proposed Northwest Paddock Wood expansion area, we are arguably the most flood vulnerable homeowner in the region. Therefore, speaking on behalf of myself and others, I consider it absolutely essential, without question, that a regional drainage strategy should be put in place and agreed up front before any planning applications are commenced, There should be no exceptions to this, which will ensure protection to people like me and my family. We must be given adequate opportunity to review the drainage strategy with our own consulting engineers to ensure that we agree with the proposals before any development is commenced. Whilst we had real reservations about the scale of development proposed around Paddock Wood, nonetheless, we've made it absolutely clear to the council that we do not wish to stand in the way of progress, and we will work with them to achieve their development ambitions in the area, provided we're properly included in the overall plans and our flooding concerns are heard. We are very reasonable people and view that the overall structure plan proposals, they're very exciting, full of opportunity for the people of Paddock Wood. It represents a tangible, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for betterment, and it should be embraced in its entirety. Even though it's not the most financially rewarding for our family, nonetheless, we've really bought into the David Locke green-blue corridor vision for our property. We're happy to be involved, and at the request of the council, we've already contributed financially to this collective master plan vision, and we're happy to continue to do so. Unfortunately, despite early assurances from the council about our inclusion, Crest Nicholson, seemingly with the support of the council pursuant to the signed statement of common ground, now seem intent on pursuing a lone development strategy without due regard for the concerns of other local stakeholders. Via various channels over the last 3 years, we've tried to communicate with Crest and the council about this, but they just haven't responded to our concerns, nor have we been included, as Mr. Sutton mentioned earlier, in any consultations with any other parties that have gone on. We just haven't been included at all. We have absolutely no wish to hold the development process to ransom, and we will happily proceed by way of an equalisation agreement fair to all parties. We're massively concerned about the implications of others blatantly disregarding the collective effort of all of us to deliver this carefully planned vision for Paddock Wood. Thoughtful adjustments to the wording now of policy STR and SS1, as proposed by Kember, Loudon Williams, should ensure that the expansion is delivered in accordance with the stated aims of the structure plan without unduly hindering operational freedom. Finally, ensuring that Chudley Brook Farm is properly included in the plan will provide immense comfort to our family, remove our flooding concerns, and importantly, allow us to sleep at night. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Whetstone. Go to Mr. Moon next, please.
I've been stopped on the video. Is that right?
That's okay. We can hear you loud and clear, so happy to continue.
Okay. Thank you, sir. People, contributions have already been made, but I think they are well worth echoing again. There appears to be, again, a definite lack of information from the main utilities, i.e. Southern Water, Drainage Board, Environment Agency, Network Rail, again within the draft local plan. And all of these utilities are major players. If you look at, again, in experience in Paddock Wood, the present mitigation for the 3 developments at the moment in progress have not actually been implemented in the original first master plan. They've been implemented in a piecemeal process, and the utilities have not actually given a coordinated, consistent contribution. It's been in reaction to maybe residents' objections and from Paddock Wood Town Council. There doesn't seem to be any evidence, real evidence, that can give the residents any confidence that the flooding issues around Paddock Wood will be mitigated against and they will be reduced, because we are in this flood risk area. I mean, I asked a real question. Are these new developments within the draft local plan in the right place? And are they actually sustainable? And again, where is the evidence? And I've seen the borough's responses to this, and it doesn't appear to be that consistent evidence. One of the aspects when you look at the modelling from new utilities, have they taken into account climate change? And how, again, do we rely on then planning conditions to actually try and mitigate that change that we can really expect in the future? There is an argument, I think, for actually slowing the water, and so you mentioned this. If you look at a lot of the thinking now within flooding mitigation across the country, rather than building on certain areas within development, they are actually rewilding, going back to letting nature hold the water back. Because that's the problem. The infrastructure in Paddock Wood basically hasn't changed for about 50 years, since the 1960s. So that infrastructure is the same. You cannot keep putting water, surface water down, and in fact foul water into these systems without improving them. Betterment was mentioned, and I know a bit about betterment because it is included in other utilities to justify a development. But when you look at the documents that have been presented in the draft local plan, what is this actual betterment and how is it proven? A lot of the time, I skeptically suspect it's there to meet the argument to justify the increased housing. If you look at drainage ponds within new developments, after a couple of 3 years, they become wildlife habitats. So in that instance, they then lose their effectiveness for what they were built for, to hold back the water and to mitigate the flood risk. And that I do not disagree with, because they're valuable habitats, but they're not what they were designed for. And as we increase with climate change, that will again reduce the effectiveness of these drainage ponds. So there should be a bigger joined up strategy of how we deal with new housing. I say not just in Paddock Wood, but across the country. One thing that surprised me was one comment that's been made that we expect this to be done. Well, I don't think that's good enough. We shouldn't be sitting here saying we expect. It should be done. And the only way it can be done is if you actually present that evidence within such a draft local plan with the sound mitigation and what will actually be implemented in detail. When you mention how to stop flooding in Paddock Wood, one of the key players will be Network Rail, because most of the foul water goes underneath the railway culverts and surface water draining back to the Medway. Now, they are notoriously slow-moving organisations. They are notoriously difficult to contact in relation to areas of flooding on their network, their land they own, etc., because in their nature, there's a high risk of trains, etc., on their land. We should be talking to them now. We should have details now within the draft local plan to implement it and to show that they've actually been talking to these people to say we're here to try and stop future flooding in Paddock Wood. If you look at those aspects within Network Rail, unfortunately, not everyone wants to pay for these improvements. So we should ask their utilities and developers to make a real contribution to capital investment within the master plan to ensure that these are in place. When I say in place, not after they've all been built, but should be in place before the houses are built.
Points noted. Yeah, we've covered those points, so we'll move on now, if we may. Go to Ms. Ashton next, please.
Thank you, sir. I'll try and be brief, because I have commented on flood risk before. As you know, my clients' interests are for the land to the east of Paddock Wood, and I know this question's predominantly been about the land to the west, but nonetheless, there is land within the eastern part of Paddock Wood that is also within flood zones 2 and 3. I would refer you back to the strategic flood risk assessments that JBA have done for the council for stages 1 and 2, and then the subsequent work that they did with David Locke Associates to help assist with the development of the master plan document that David Locke Associates produced. The David Locke Associates document itself at page 67 has within it a detailed plan that shows the extent of flood risk around Paddock Wood. And I think, as I've said to you before, if you compare that then with the option 1 structure plan that is being brought forward within the local plan, that seeks to ensure no development within flood zone 1, within flood zones 2 and 3, within the land to the east. We have, through the detailed work on the preparation of development to the east, sought to ensure that the majority of development is within flood zone 1. As I've alluded to before, there is an element that is in flood zone 2, in particular that associated with major infrastructure works, i.e. the crossing that links us with the Church Farm development to the west. There is also a small element of residential development within flood zone 2, but as has been alluded to by the local authority, the NPPF does not prevent that, and the actual number of units proposed within that area is minimal and would be addressed through compensatory development in any event. I think also it would be helpful, sir, just to cross-refer you back to what the policy says. And if you look at point 13 of policy STR SS1, it is clear in that the development will need to ensure a drainage strategy is in place in consultation with the local planning authority, KCC as a drainage authority, and Southern Water prior to the grant of planning permission for any substantial development on the site, unless exceptional circumstances arise. This should demonstrate that there is adequate capacity in the foul sewage network and that development will not exacerbate flooding elsewhere. The drainage strategy should be implemented through the development to deliver the level of storage, attenuation and mitigation measures to reduce the incidence of flooding to adjacent residential areas in Paddock Wood. And there is a clear indication within the policy as to what is expected. I can say, in bringing forward our application, are looking at detailed storage measures within the site through SUDS. That would actually, when you look at it in the context of pre-development greenfield runoff rates relative to post-development runoff rates, incorporating a 1 in 100 plus 40% climate change allowance, see a betterment of 77%. In effect, our pre-development greenfield runoff rates will reduce from 23.7 to 5.3. That is a massive change. And whilst I accept the fact that there have been issues historically with Network Rail and the management of the culverts underneath the railway and the implications that has on flood risk, the first thing to note is that as far as my clients' interests are concerned, that area is actually managed through the master plan to be maintained as a flood area in effect, with additional storage brought into it. But as I say, with our reduction in surface water runoff rates, we will help significantly reduce the scale of water going through that culvert at a time of flood risk. And in addition to that, the developments themselves will see effective management of the land, including the water resources within the land. That will help the longer term management and effective running of the drainage strategy. And whilst I accept what the previous speaker said about the fact that SUDs in many occasions end up becoming landscape ecological areas as well, the fact of the matter is that in bringing forward a comprehensive development, your landscape, ecological and drainage consultants all liaise with one another, and your management plan looks to manage those areas effectively to deal with all scenarios. That is the way that we're looking to develop the land to the east of Paddock Wood, and we have been in detailed discussions with Network Rail and all of the other statutory providers in terms of the implications of flood risk. And as the council have alluded to before, you also have before you statements of common ground with them to demonstrate that they are happy with the strategy as it stands at the moment. I hope that assists.
Okay. Thank you. Go to Carol Williams next, please. Get any additional points you've not already heard?
Thank you. It's just some local knowledge of the sites to the west of Paddock Wood. Currently, the gravelly, we've heard about the Chudley Brook, but we haven't heard about the importance of the Gravelly Way stream, which will run alongside one of the proposed developments on the southwest. And if you look at what happens to the Gravelly Way stream, that actually, the bank on the left going north is higher than the bank on the right, which backs on to Ribston, Bramley and Laxton Gardens roads. And the residents of those three roads regularly have to go and clear the grill covering the culvert underneath the railway. Now, this isn't a 1 in 100 year incident. This is every year during periods of high rainfall. What happens is debris gets into the Gravelly Way stream, it builds up at the grill, and I note the agreement with Tunbridge Wells, although the agreement is very vague with Tunbridge Wells, it mentions they're in discussion, but the agreement with Tunbridge Wells with Network Rail is that they will clear the culvert once a year. But the residents are having to clear that on a very regular basis. And also with reference to the culverts to the east of Paddock Wood, the Upper Medway Internal Drainage Board have put forward what looks like a very good costed plan to deal with that, to expand the bellmouth to the culvert that goes under the railway. And my understanding from latest discussions, which Claire Riley was quite right, we haven't been involved in, is that that plan isn't being taken forward. The Upper Medway Internal Drainage Board told us that was the only way to prevent the flooding building up on the south side of the railway for the existing developments that are going ahead. That's not accounting for any of these new developments which will rely exactly on those culverts relating to the East and West Roden. So there are already problems with the existing developments and the culvert going under the railway to the east of Paddock Wood at Church Farm. So this is a really important issue for the existing residents of Paddock Wood, who regularly see themselves having to, resolve the flooding issues themselves. Thank you.
Ms. Fenton.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, I'm grateful to Carol for raising that, because it's identified an issue that 5 Oak Green has. The culverts, they don't clean themselves. Once a year would be insufficient. I have to raise the fact that we talked a little bit about it yesterday, but Capel floods from Hartlake Road right the way through to Paddock Wood. It's a massive area. What is the advice regarding the Medway floodplain? The advice from the EA, town planners, is don't build in it. You are storing up so many problems. We only talk about betterment for new residents. We don't really hear about it for existing ones. They don't address the issues. I'm very worried about anything being pushed through culverts by developers, excess water, because that will just rush down to the Medway. That brings us straight onto the cumulative impact of the other settlements on the Medway floodplain. You heard from Tunbridge and Malling Borough Council yesterday, Yalding, East Peckham, Laddingford, they flood horrendously. So you're just pushing the water that you have displaced by development. There's no doubt about it. Our community was right. You put something in a floodplain, you will displace that water. That water has to go somewhere. It will go straight into the Medway. It will flood downriver. The other thing that worries me is certain storage mitigation has been removed since Reg 18, specifically storage mitigation on Colts Hill seems to have gone. Those of us, as I say, who live in 5 Oak Green, local knowledge is vital. We flooded in 2020. This is surface water rushing down from Pembury. We flooded right the way through. The figures the council were talking about for betterment in Five Oak Green is horrendously low. They told you 250 houses yesterday in Five Oak Green. Capel floods, the whole of Capel. I attached to our hearing statement the KCC figures. They are the lead authority. It's 592 properties as of 2017. That will not get lower, it will get higher. Of those, 321 are medium to high risk. The thought that they are going to build all over Capel and Paddock Wood is horrendous. It really is. I would also like to know internal roads within East Capel, how are these going to affect the new properties? There's all sorts of issues, and we're not hearing anything. We're talking about desktop studies. Nobody talks to local people and their local knowledge. 2020 was horrendous. The flood scheme for Five Oak Green, this funnel in the road, it's not going to it's not even going to catch Capel, where all the properties flooded. It's the wrong side. Thank you.
Hi, Ms. Bell.
Mute because you're going to.
Sir, just a few points on behalf of Safe Capel. Sir, the first thing to say is obviously you heard from various residents, including Councillor Fenton and Ms. Whetstone, about the effect that flooding has on the locals. Sir, it probably assists just to refresh your memory that when you're considering this, to have a look at the appendix to Save Capel's Regulation 19 submission, and it's Appendix 13, which is a fairly detailed paper setting out the effect of flooding. It contains photographs, and it's quite illuminative as to the actual effect flooding has on the area. But sir, other than that, just 2 points on behalf of Save Capel. Sir, one of the issues is it comes back to Save Capel's position that the council hasn't really considered alternatives and whether or not there is actually a need to develop in flood zones 2 and 3. And actually, sir, if they restricted development to the kind of flood zone 1, it would effectively be half of the excess dwellings which are included in the housing buffer of some 1,200. I think this was discussed at matter 2. So in respect to the drainage strategy that's set out in paragraph 13 of STRSS 1, one of the things that particularly concerns Save Capel is this inclusion of an exceptional circumstances test, which doesn't provide Save Capel with the reassurance that any form under any circumstance of adequate drainage strategy could be put into place, because of course we don't know what amounts to exceptional circumstances. All we know is that the area floods and there has to be a drainage strategy. It's unclear as to what exceptional circumstances could possibly exist to avoid the need to put such a strategy in place. And sir, just 1 point in respect to the sequential test. And sir, we just draw your attention to paragraph 13 in the sorry, so I've just lost the document reference, but bear with me 1 moment. So it's document CD3.105 A to B, and it's the combined SFRA. And so it's very clear within 13.2, where the SFRA says that it has not performed the sequential test of potential development sites. So we just flagged that for kind of your attention. But those are the points made on behalf of Safe Capel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we did discuss the sequential test in quite some detail on the on 2 previous sessions in the week commencing, or the last week in May. So we'd go through that in quite some detail. Look, Mr. Kindred, please.
Morning, sir. Adam Kindred, CBRE on behalf of Dandara. So Dandara have an interest on the southwestern portion of the land at Paddock Wood. Conscious of time, and I think the point that I wanted to make is a relatively quick and succinct point just from listening to the discussion today. I think just in terms of the application of 161 of the NPPF, I think it's perhaps slightly more sophisticated than some of the discussion has led you to believe. There's definitely, obviously, for the sequential test, very much a kind of avoidance-led approach, and that's one element of 161. But I think equally important, and particularly important in the context of Paddock Wood, is 161C, which I think looks at a bit more of a proactive solution for dealing with flood risk and looking at the opportunities that new development provides in managing and mitigating flood risk. And when 161 is considered as a whole, I think it's entirely consistent with the evidence base and the approach that Tunbridge Wells Borough Council have taken to Paddock Wood. And not to sort of stray into the discussion of the afternoon and exceptional circumstances, I think there's very much a point around, it goes to something that Mr. Sutton raised, that in circumstances like this, that there isn't an alternative viable proposition that we know that anyone's producing to say that this kind of improvement or level of improvement can be achieved without development. And development is the key bit that unlocks this. And I think it's 161C of the NPPF that is acknowledging that the role that development, wider development, plays in being able to provide betterment for things such as flood risk, because it's not something that ordinarily the DEA, and I think we had mentioned to no mitigation being provided from the 60s, it's obviously not something that historically has been done in the absence of development. So that's the point that, I just wanted to make, that it probably strays into stuff that we'll come on to this afternoon.
And just the final point from me, and obviously I'll hand over to council to sort of mop up, Ray, but it's a question for the council, and they may want to come back to some of the points as well. We talked a lot previously about the sequential test and the way in which sites have been selected, and Mr. Hayes in particular has made several representations about the sequential test. Question for the council. NPPF says, obviously, all plans should apply a sequential risk-based approach to location and development, so as to avoid, where possible, flood risk to people and property. And it says they should do this by this is paragraph 161 of the framework, applying the sequential test, and then, if necessary, the exception test as set out below, and then it goes through. So question for the council. Is it necessary to apply the exception test for any of these allocations in areas which are subject to the risk of flooding? And if so, has the council done that?
So the council's response to this and is set out in its hearing statement, but to elaborate on that, and I would draw attention to start with to paragraph 162 of the NPPF, which sets out firstly the aim of the sequential test, but then goes on to say if there are development should not be allocated or permitted if there are reasonably available sites appropriate for the proposed development in areas with a lower risk of flooding. And this picks up on a point that Mr. Kindred just made around the factors to be considered in the round when looking at whether there are sites which are available and are appropriate for the proposed developments. So the council's view in terms of the sequential test is that, well, to take it through step by step and without going through a lot of detail, which was covered in relation to, I believe it was matter 3, issue 2, where the council set out in detail how flooding has been considered and throughout the process, throughout the Sheila, throughout the sustainability appraisal, etc.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I won't go through that again. The sustainability appraisal, so and the sequential test was applied. It was factored in through those considerations, whether land was in flood risks, flood zones 1, 2 or 3, was detailed in the Sheila. We discussed at previous examination sessions how the council had considered land to the west of Paddock Wood. It wasn't ruled out because there are substantial areas in flood zone 1. As the council was then looking at areas, and this is where I come back to 162, appropriate for the proposed development, the SA has ruled out, when considering a variety of wider measures, other locations for developments, particularly strategic growth. And so it's a plan that we've kept coming back to, the plan which shows the locations of the other proposals for strategic growth, which include all of those in the AONB, and indeed those that were looked at outside the AONB as well.
Just to stop you there, just at a site-specific level then, and this goes back to, and I don't want to get drawn into the detail of the sequential test again, but just keeping it at quite a high level, really, what national planning policy is directing local planning authorities and strategic decision makers to do. So there is an option to develop in land outside of flood risk areas, and that was your option. So the option 1 or option 3, I can't remember which one it was. Yes. But there was an option there, and this goes right back to the start of this discussion that I had. And I asked the lady from DLA, and I said, "Well, you've got an option there. You don't have to do this. You don't have to go and build in these areas." And the response was given, well, it was to meet a target that was given at Reg 18 stage. It was to meet that indicative housing target. Now, what the point that representatives have made is, given that you're oversupplying, you've got a buffer of housing against minimum housing needs, and we'll come on to talk about the buffer. What the point that representatives have made is, well, you've actually got quite a generous buffer, and you're providing more housing than actually is the need, and notwithstanding comments about capped housing requirements, etc. We've got a generous buffer, so actually you don't need to build these houses in the flood zones to meet that housing need. That underlying housing need would still be met. So the second part of that question is then, okay, well, if you don't build in the flood zones, you don't go for option 3, then you're about 600 dwellings short. And the other point that was raised is about, well, that then starts to affect viability, and that's what's referred to in the DLA report. The question for me, really, just on the second point, is there anything within the evidence that says you have to build in these flood zones to make this development viable? Is there any viability hook to say, well, we can't just have option 3, we can't just avoid flood zones because the whole thing falls down, it just doesn't become viable?
Yes, and I will. I'm pleased that you've asked me to focus just on that point. And I would draw attention to paragraph 7.14 of the strategic sites topic paper, and I'll ask colleagues for the CD reference to that. What that sets out is that there was an option, obviously the option which looks for only development in flood zone 1. That resulted in a reduced development capacity at Paddock Wood, including land in East Capel, and it was one of the iterations, one of the different scenarios, which was subject to viability testing by Dixon Searle. So obviously that will be set out in the stage 2 viability assessment undertaken by Dixon Searle. And what that set out is that the results of that meant that the residual land values was lower than the baseline land values, and therefore would have made the development unviable at the level of affordable housing set out in policy. So yes, it was considered. The topic paper is the high level point where that's set out. The link to the other evidence is the scenario in the Dixon Cell stage 2 study.
Okay, we can go back to that. Mr. Hayes, anything to add?
Yes, thank you, sir. I mean, as it sounds like we are talking about the sequential tests now rather than later in the afternoon. Is that the case?
I don't want to go back through it. I think we've had a lot on the sequential test. The question was about whether or not the exception test applied. Because mindful that we really did we really did give this one a good going over before. We've had a lot on the sequential test. I've got all those points, so I don't need anything further on it.
I mean, I guess the reason I wanted to raise it was because it seems the answer still hasn't been given as to, you know, how did we get here in terms of Paddock Wood, and it seems that the sequential, you know, the council's arguing that the sequential test is sort of by proxy been looked at through a master planning sort of process where they've already decided to put housing in Paddock Wood. My understanding of the sequential test is actually at the plan making level, the more strategic level, you look to areas in flood zone 1 before you then look elsewhere. And the consultants in the SFRA looked at all of the Sheelaw sites, well, the ones that made it past the first screening anyway. And so I think there's about 450 sites in total that were looked at by them. And so there are other areas within flood risk zone 1 within the borough, which the council could have looked at.
All points I am well aware of, Mr. Hayes, and we really did give this quite a lot of detailed discussion at previous sessions. So we don't need to go through it again. That's not me saying it's not important. I'm just saying we had a considerable amount of discussion on this. I've got my notes from those sessions. I completely understand the points you're making, and I've taken into account the council's response. So that's something for me to go away with. I'm not trying to sort of shut you down in any way. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just saying that we really did have a very detailed and in-depth discussion about this at the other session. So unless you've got any comments just on the application of the exception test, which is the point that I put to the council.
No, I don't think I heard a kind of clear answer to that from the council to you, but yes, no, I don't have any other on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Williams, anything?
I'm not sure that it entirely relates to the exception test, but in terms of viability, I don't understand why other areas of the borough, where if you look at the settlement hierarchy, areas around Hawkhurst and Cranbrook, although they're in the area of outstanding natural beauty and they're on the high Weald, there are opportunities to develop around those sites. And in terms of settlement hierarchy, they are actually much more viable than the centre of Paddock Wood. And we're coming to talk about the town centre later, but the town centre in Paddock Wood is severely under threat at the moment. And that, you know, there are other options for development, which I don't believe have been looked at because they ruled out AONB rather than ruling out flood zone. You know, the place they didn't want to build is in the AONB because it's difficult to persuade residents in other areas that that's acceptable.
Okay, I think again that goes back to the strategy day. Really, we really did give this some quite detailed consideration as to earlier questions. So yeah, certainly important points, ones that I'll certainly take into account, which is in terms of the context of discussion. I feel like we've already sort of been here with these points. Mr. Bourne, anything further you want to add?
So it was only if it would assist you for Mr. Gibson to provide some commentary on some of the points that were raised in the sort of round table points earlier. If not, then we're happy.
Okay. Only if you think it's necessary. If not, I'm happy to break for lunch. We can, let's say we've probably got quite a bit of scope within the afternoon. If we stop for lunch now, we can always come back to some points if you want to do any wrapping up at the end. We've got the highway matters. We've got highway matters, some of the exceptional circumstances, and landscape character, and a couple of questions around the town centre. So I think if there was anything that you wanted to wrap up on flooding, then there's probably scope to do so after lunch.
I'll discuss it with the teams. Thank
you. Okay, we'll adjourn for lunch. So we'll come back. We'll move on to highways. Just for clarity, then, so we'll adjourn until 2 o'clock. Please log out and then log back in for the afternoon session using the new